It was deep night outside. It seemed that the whole city was already asleep, although everything around was illuminated by the large red moon. The young man lay in the middle of the street, his eyes wide open, drooling from his mouth, and he could barely make any sounds, pain gripping his entire body. Not far from the young man lay a beautiful girl, her blonde hair scattered across the asphalt, and her body flushed. A stranger with a wound on his face leaned over the blonde, smiling nastily as he touched the beauty's clothes. Unfortunately for the criminal, he did not know that behind him, down a narrow alley, his punishment was approaching in the form of a tall guy with a stick in his hand. The hero called the scoundrel so that he would not have time to harm the girl in any way and would distract his attention from her, at least for a short time. The guy with the wound on his face turned around at the sound of someone else's voice, but he realized it was too late. Fear was engraved on his face. It was him. The young man could not be mistaken. He knew who he had met, which greatly pleased his pride. The hero swung his stick. He realized that in front of him was a rapist who was also called the electric shock staff. In the eyes of the criminal, the inevitability of retribution for all his sins is frozen, and the silhouette of his executioner, there is nowhere to run. Everything is over for him. Zhao Yu took out a cigarette from the pack. In his past life, he had accidentally fallen to his death. Later, he found himself in this body. Once before, the young man was the #1 of the criminal world, and now he is part of a group of detectives investigating serious achievements in the city of Q. This afternoon, the head of the department made everyone work overtime until the criminal stun staff was caught, which did not please the detective, who had long wanted to rest. Zhao Yu thought about his future life and whether he should return to the old, familiar activities from the past. The guy took his first drag and coughed, his lungs filled with a foreign substance. His new body was not at all able to smoke. Horror gripped the young man. He did not understand at all what was happening and why the space had changed. It was all like a bolt from the blue. An unknown program appeared before the young man's eyes, which no one else had seen, which only made him more frightened. The system was launched. Zhao Yu had only heard of such a mechanism before, but had never encountered it, and now he was able to see it in person. Could it really be the same mythical program? The young man recalled that his life had previously been completely different, full of friends and parties, but the past could no longer be returned. Nothing was repeated twice. The guy's cigarette was slowly smoldering. He couldn't yet imagine what benefit this program could bring him. The detective sat on a bar stool and smoked. He thought about his situation and realized that in this damned place he didn't have a single acquaintance. He couldn't believe that his whole life would pass like this. Zhao Yu saw something next to him that distracted him from his heavy thoughts about the past and future. Incredibly beautiful long legs, covered in black nylon tights, a breast that promised to haunt the young man for more than one night in his sweetest dreams and fantasies. On the next chair, behind the bar, sat a stunningly beautiful girl. She sipped red wine from her glass and cast shameless glances in the direction of the young man. This lady was simply perfect, as if she had stepped out of the pages of glossy magazines, and the detective was eager to get at least a crumb of her attention. The blonde turned to the young man who had called her and looked at him with a long, expectant gaze. The guy decided to turn on all his charm to the maximum and meet a beautiful blonde. Unfortunately for Zhao Yua, the girl wanted 3,000 for the night, and he could barely scrape together one. It was just a terrible robbery. The young man still had not lost hope that perhaps the girl would give in to her own principles and give the charming stranger at least a small discount. The hero was interrupted by another guy who could afford to communicate with such a gorgeous lady and led the beauty to his luxurious suite in a hotel up the street, and the detective could only watch as their backs walked away. Suddenly, the guy's gaze was drawn to another strange young man who was with them in the bar and had been watching the action from the other end of the room the whole time. The boy also noticed that the detective was watching him, and surprise and fear flashed across his scratched face. The hero didn't like the guy's look, which he communicated to him not only verbally, but also using sign language. The young man pulled his hood up, covering the wounds on his face, and walked away towards the exit. But it was obvious to Zhao Yua that the man's behavior was strange. He had known such people from his past life. The detective recalled that during the collection they told about a thief who rapes women of low social status with electric sticks, and also the last victim slashed his face, which allowed him to take a DNA sample. It was a very strange coincidence that a guy met a serial rapist just by walking into a bar. It was hard to believe. The young man knew that catching pagans was the job of the police, to which he now belonged. But he was still not sure how much he needed to be fair in his new life. The officer walked out into the alley near the bar. The silhouette of the red moon was reflected in the lawns, illuminating everything around and making it possible to see the surroundings. The guy was walking down a narrow street. He was a master of surveillance. In his past life, he himself often hid in such places. The detective touched the unknown object with the tip of his boot, and he came across the young man from the luxury room, whom he had seen earlier in the bar. Zhao Yu's eyes widened in horror. Although he knew where he was going, but seeing him did not throw him off balance. The guy did not expect this at all. The young man's body lay right in the middle of a dirty alley on the asphalt in an unnatural, stretched-out pose. The detective moved on, realizing that he had picked up the right scent and was moving in the right direction. It was definitely him, the criminal. Zhao Yu saw him and ran faster, grabbing a wooden stick with him. The guy approached silently. The rapist was too carried away by his victim. Nothing else interested him, and he did not notice anyone around him. The guy was pleased. His conclusion was correct. The young man saw the same guy from the bar with a scratched face. The scoundrel turned around. He understood what his carelessness could lead to. The detective found him and approached him unnoticed, point blank. Zhao Yu had knocked the guy out with one blow of his stick, the stunned stick lying at his feet in the middle of a narrow, dirty alley. A crowd gathered outside the police station. The DNA test results came back. The man was definitely the criminal, and he was finally caught, but no one expected that it would be Officer Zhao who would arrest him. The hero left. He was not interested in the conversations of his colleagues, only the bonus given to the rapist. It was a very acceptable bonus. The guy was very pleased with himself and the money, very good for his first day on the job as a detective. The system appeared unexpectedly. The young man managed to forget about its existence, but it reminded him with a message that the meeting was over with a completion rate of 75%, and the guy received an invisible disposable bug. After using the bug, it was possible to conduct secret wiretapping, and it was impossible to detect it with any device. Simply an indispensable gift in police work. At the police station, Zhao Yua was also asked how he knew where the criminal would be, and he had no answer. The young man was afraid to admit to himself whether the system had really arranged this meeting for him. On the way home, the hero thought about what all this meant. 75% completion apparently had something to do with the mission. Surely, if he had not followed that rapist, the degree of completion would have been much lower. The boy thought about the events of the evening. Already at the bedside, the detective realized that it didn't matter how many meetings the system arranged for him, because it would depend only on him whether the criminal was behind bars or not. Zhao Yu wanted to relax in his own bed. However, after a very hard day, he didn't know if he would be able to solve the crime next time. But his thoughts did not weigh him down. The young man did not know much and trusted chance, but he was sure that when the time for the awards came, he would have a good rest in the company of charming and very pleasant ladies. With his thoughts and hopes for the future, the exhausted guy from the day fell into a sweet sleep. At 5 o'clock in the morning, there were few establishments open in the city. Only KFC beckoned visitors with bright lights, hot food, and the promise of round-the-clock service. A very tired detective sat at a table in the establishment and munched on his burger. His well-deserved rest was interrupted by his roommate, who snored louder than a train locomotive. Other early guests at the establishment could feel the guy radiating negativity and irritation in waves. Wasn't this how he wanted to start his new day? The hostel where Zhao Yu stayed was too loud and constantly smelled of something unpleasant, and the young man liked this place less and less every day. The hero lit a cigarette, thinking over all the possible options. He was immediately going to rent some new housing, in which there would be no terrible neighbors. The young man's lungs were mercilessly scorched by the acrid smoke, and an unbearable cough began to choke him. This body was completely incompatible with smoking. Something happened that the young man could not predict, because he was not yet accustomed to the new existence. The system launched a new adventure. The 57th hexagram of Qigong breathing said to go with the flow, live in peace and quiet, revolve around nature, and be successful. Was this system really based on the theory of the 8 trigrams? The detective smiled. He liked this plan. What could be wrong with going with the flow? And some girl was walking towards the young man. The woman looked bad. She was shaking. There were traces of blood on her face and she was begging someone to help. Zhao Yu finally noticed the brunette. His eyes widened and the blood drained from his face. What he saw made him quite worried. The woman in red fell onto the road in front of the detective and the stunned audience. On the morning of April 22nd, the woman collapsed in front of a KFC on J Street, where she was found by a passing officer, Zhao could not leave the unfortunate woman in trouble. He helped stop the bleeding and then called an ambulance and the police. The victim is currently in hospital and is out of danger. However, police believe that this case is connected to another unsolved case that is already a year old. The detective watched the reconstruction of the events on television, but thought it was not good enough because the reporters were unable to reveal the full heroism of his actions. The guy returned to his interlocutor with a sly smile and asked what she thought about this report. Lying on the hospital bed was a girl with a severed arm, which he had found the previous morning in front of KFC. The brunette didn't like that the police still couldn't track down the criminal. And everyone was asking stupid questions, so she didn't want to see the policeman now and threw a pillow at him. Nothing could worsen Zhou Yua's mood. The guy was having fun like it was the last time. He even noticed that the girl's second hand had a lot of strength. This was the last straw for the woman. She threw a slipper at the boy and thus finally pushed him out the door, where his assistant was already waiting for him. The junior police officer asked her senior not to be so rude, since the woman had already lost her arm. The hero took the papers from the assistant. He believed that one should see the good side of everything, since at least the woman still had her left hand. The young man looked at the file on the criminal's third victim, Luo Main, who was currently lying in the ward. The criminal hid in the girl's car while she unsuspectingly drove home. The maniac pounced on his victim from the back seat and knocked her out, then stopped the car on G Street, where he cut off the woman's hand. The victim woke up the next morning, got out of the car and walked towards the nearest building in search of help. Li Weini, the guy's assistant, knew that this was a case of a serial hand thief. He had appeared for the third time. The last time their team couldn't find a single clue. This time, the detectives absolutely had to solve the case, and they had to do it before the second squad because the commander had promised to pay Zhou Yua for the TV he had recently broken as a reward. The young man believed that he had nothing to fear because nothing was impossible for him. The young man considered himself all-powerful. Today, the same system that helped him find the criminal last time appeared again. Thanks to the program, the detective was able not only to catch the rapist post-soak taser, but also helped him rent a new apartment. Now, thanks to this system, it is impossible to find a better Zhou Yua detective in the entire universe. The boy turned to the junior policewoman again, wondering what they knew about the previous two victims. The criminal caught the second victim in an underground passage and left her as his right hand, a rather banal story. With the third girl, everything was much more interesting. She fell asleep at home in the evening and soon woke up in the same place, but without an arm. The new information really interested the detective. There was something unusual about it that didn't fit into the standard scenario. The blonde also noticed this strange detail. There were no signs of a break-in in the victim's house, which meant that the criminal probably had a key. Zhou Yu looked at the case records again, and traces of bewilderment and just a little misunderstanding could be seen on his face. The assistant did not immediately notice the hesitant young man and moved on, telling him that the criminal had somehow bypassed the surveillance cameras and that there were no traces of DNA or fingerprints at the crime scenes. Finally, the girl noticed that she was walking alone and turned around to see that something was wrong with her elder brother and that he had fallen significantly behind. The young man realized that this time he might fail, and he would need money to pay off the debt for the broken TV. Unnoticed, while talking about the case, the young people left the hospital. The girl saw something interesting that was able to distract her from the problems with the hand thief. There were vendors on the street offering to take a group photo with a real camel. And the junior officer would very much like to do this with her colleague. The girl looked back. Someone was calling for help and asking to stop the robber, but even this could not distract the guy from the papers. An unknown young man ran past the couple at breakneck speed, which greatly worried Li Weini. The lady was very worried. She thought that they, as the police, should help catch the robber. Zhou Yua had a completely opposite view of the situation. He did not understand why they, as employees of the Serious Crimes Department, would deal with some petty robber. The guy remembered that his assistant wanted to take a photo with a camel and suggested doing it while the traders were still in the square. A girl with long dark hair was running after the robber, begging him to help stop him. The beauty didn't know what else to do, because the robber had snatched her bag and was now moving away very quickly. Zhou Yua knew her. He remembered her face from his past life, and he could never forget it again. Fear froze on the guy's face. Could it be that he was not the only one who was reborn in this amazing world? The detective threw the papers to his uncomprehending assistant and stuck his feet into the stream. The senior officer proudly jumped onto the ship of the desert, and his junior colleague wanted to figure out what was going on, because the guy's behavior seemed very strange to her. The hero looked into the distance where the man and the girl had just run. He was going to come to the lady's aid and stop the criminal. The camel rushed at incredible speed and meters of asphalt disappeared under its hooves every week. Vegetables flew off the shelves of merchants, causing irreparable financial and moral damage to sellers. Zhou Yu was catching up with the petty criminal. He was approaching him with irreversible force, leaving no chance for salvation. The sellers were sorting out the mess left behind by the guy's chase. They really didn't like the situation that had developed. The damage done was enormous. The hero approached the man. He could already feel the animal's breath on the back of his neck. A little more and this capricious one would catch up with him. The robber was let down by the current situation. He hoped to easily leave with the girl's handbag, but now his chances were decreasing exponentially, so he took out a hidden bladed weapon from his pocket. Zhou Yu caught up with the guy. He didn't make any effort, unlike the robber, who was very tired and ran with all his strength. The detective was almost surprised to see the glint of metal in the guy's hands. He didn't know what he was hoping for. The criminal could not understand what this weirdo on the web wanted from him and why he was pursuing him. The hero did not want to waste any more time on empty talk. He took a wooden painting from the counter and dropped it on the head of the disturber of the piece. The robber's head was splitting. Tears were flowing from his eyes. He was still trying to find out from the guy who he was. He was a modern prince on a red horse, just the kind this city and its people deserved. Is this what an officer should be like? Since when was it unclear to anyone around why the police were hiring crazy people? The guard was very unhappy with the pogrom at the market, believing that through Zhou Yua the entire alley had turned into a dump and was afraid that soon all the sellers would come to them in mourning. The irritated man in uniform was interrupted by his partner, who was waving his detective ID. The guy actually worked in the serious crimes unit. The hero was frankly bored listening to the security guard's squabble. Did he really deserve such gratitude for his heroic act? The brunette pulled the guy out of his thoughts. She was grateful for the returned things. The young lady worked as a nurse in the hospital, so now, if the young man needed anything, she would be happy to help. Although Yao Jia looked like the guy's acquaintance from his past life and had the same name, it was definitely not her. His old acquaintance was too squeamish to work as a nurse. The detective handed the beauty a phone. He wanted to keep in touch with this person, whoever he was, of course, if he didn't mind. The guy didn't care who this woman was in this life. He just didn't want to lose her again. The system reminded of itself again, scared the guy. The collision was completed. Zhou Yu sat on the curb outside the building. The quest completion rate was 72% and received an invisible eavesdropping device. The hero wondered if all the meetings that the system arranged were really random. The guy was so deep in thought that he didn't notice his assistant approaching. The detective was sipping a cold drink when he thought about the investigation. The system had arranged a meeting with Yao Jia for him. He should have understood how the meeting scenarios worked before using it. The young man tightly clutched the empty tin in his hand. He was not ready to constantly get into events that he did not need. For now, Zhou Yu could only rely on his own strength, which meant it was time to find more information on the case. The guy stood up abruptly, which even scared the blonde a little. It was time for them to get going. At the Serious Crimes Unit, the couple met team chairwoman W. Kuping, who was very unhappy that the guy was not working, unlike the rest of the precinct who had to do his job. To catch the criminal, all the police officers worked overtime, except for one officer who was fooling around the whole time and minding his own business. The detective was distracted from a not very pleasant conversation by something very interesting. In contrast to the boring conversation, behind the colleague was a huge board with a full analysis of the current case of the hand thief. Zhou Yu was very interested in the information that the police had collected during the entire investigation. There was a lot of information there that he had not even guessed about. The team leader looked at the young man and remembered how she had recently been told that the people on the team she was now the leader of were very talented. While the young man was looking at the board, the brunette was wondering why she had never heard of this reckless guy before, who had not participated in the investigation, and now wanted to take her case and take all the credit for himself. The senior officer knew that the boy had argued with the leader, Captain Liu, who had caught the criminal on his own and much earlier than the other police officers. Now the detective realized that he was not omnipotent and came to ask for help from Team B, or perhaps specifically from its leader. The main character was irritated by this self-confident woman who believed that she knew everything in the world better than others. The altercation took on crazy proportions. None of the policemen wanted to retreat from their point of view. It was like a clash between two unyielding rocks. Zhou Yu was becoming increasingly frustrated by the self-confident brunette, and Ku Ping knew which strings to pull to throw the guy off balance. The young man hit the board with his hand, trapping the brunette between his body and the wall. She didn't expect this and was puzzled by his actions. The guy was very pleased with himself. He said that he came here for something that was completely unrelated to the matter, but he did not elaborate. The detective told the girl to relax. He didn't plan to push her out of the case and solve it before Group B. The squabble didn't please the Piggly captains at all, because no one dared to humiliate their main one. Zhou Yua smiled, because the department was wasting its time on work that was going nowhere. He was confident that he could do much better. The attacker was able to avoid all the cameras because he was either familiar with the area or even lived in the same area as the victim, the officers believed. Unfortunately for the police, the criminal had placed an invisible bug and was listening to them the entire time. The only one who could see and listen to the device was Officer Joe, thanks to the devices that the system issued to him, and he was very pleased with this fact. The guy was still standing in the middle of the department, looking at the board, but mentally he was already very far away, where the hand thief had once operated. Tests showed that Luo Ming used inhalation, 2 types of anesthetics, and intravenous injection, one of which was an anesthetic often used on animals, a tranquilizer. Then, using a chopping, sharp weapon like an axe, he left the woman's hands with one powerful blow. The perpetrator dragged the first victim through the tunnels, so it could be assumed that he was a large and strong man. The forensic expert noted that the villain did not chop off the strong humerus, so it is possible that it could have been a woman. And the expert also found traces of some substance on Luo Ming's car. At the scene of the events, there were fingerprints everywhere, but this still did not explain why the attacker had so carefully concealed his figure. The car was captured on a huge number of traffic cameras as it moved along the road, but none of them showed the criminal. Could it be that what the suspect was hiding under the hood was long, blonde hair? The detective's enlightened guess could explain a lot. The villain was probably a woman, but why the blonde did this was completely unclear, because all 3 victims were not connected in any way. Perhaps the criminal acted completely by chance, or she had some kind of mental illness. In fact, nothing explained why the attacker only took the hands. There must be some logical reason for this. The detective had a brilliant idea and finally realized that the reason for everything was revenge. The guy forgot that he was still in the police department, and there were many colleagues around him who did not understand how he came to such a conclusion. Zhou Yua had the best explanation for all his judgments, an incredibly strong intuition. The criminal sat in front of the board. One more name could be crossed off. Her list was getting shorter. The girl's unusual collection slowly grew, and now she had 3 hands. Time continued to move constantly. The hours had already passed north. The city had long since fallen silent. Its inhabitants were sleeping at home. In the department, everyone was already resting, except for Detective Joe. He believed that if the attacker takes the hands, then she keeps them somewhere in the city, which only she knows about, and every time she sees their anger, she consoles them a little. The detective lit a cigarette. No one could explain why the victim's right hands were taken. What was special about that hand for the criminal? It was very strange. This time his body did not react to smoking in any way. Quite a pleasant surprise. The guy had something that could help him in this matter. Perhaps right now the system will help him. It's time to turn on the secret weapon. Zhou Yu started the script. The action was starting right now. The girl hid behind a flower bed. She didn't understand how much longer she would have to wait. The young man was watching a very interesting picture until he really understood what was happening. The young lady called the detective on the phone. She was near the police station. The girl saw a cute white kitten, which explained the strange pose in which the detective found her. The young brunette smiled at the young man. She was glad to see him. Zhao Yu asked what the girl was doing near the department at such an early hour, but she considered them accomplices, so she came to him. The young people met when the young lady tried to steal money. She begged the detective not to tell her father about it, as he would not be pleased with his daughter's actions. The main character agreed, but on the condition that they would divide the stolen goods equally between the 2 of them. The little lady had no idea that the young man was blackmailing her only in order to rent a place from her father, but he denied everything, because now they were accomplices. Once upon a time, this was exactly how the trigram brought them together, although the guy would never have thought about it. Zhou Yu went with the flow, and that was what led him to his new home. The hero was tired. He hadn't slept all night and wasn't in the mood for riddles, so he asked her to tell him right away what the girl wanted from him. What the boy asked for was something he could never have expected. He wanted the detective to go to his parent-teacher meeting. The guy couldn't believe how anyone in their right mind could suggest such a thing. She was probably joking. But the girl had already deleted the message on her father's phone and sent it to her accomplice. The guy doubted the offer because he didn't want to stay in his new home. But even in this case, the young lady had a plan. If her father kicked the brunette out of the apartment, he could always stay with her. He would make a good dad. The girl saw that the guy's gaze softened. She understood that her magic was working on him. Zhou Yu agreed, but on the condition that his landlord's daughter would never call him dad again. The detective was sitting at a parent-teacher meeting at music school No. 2 and was frankly bored. The girl believed that they were in the same boat, and if her father found out about her skipping classes and revealing personal information, then they would both get into trouble. The guy still couldn't understand how he got involved, how this girl forced him to be provoked. The boy sat in the assembly hall with other parents and couldn't wait for the concert to end. Zhou Yu carefully observed the pianist's hands. They were incredibly beautiful. The young man could not understand what had to happen for someone to want to deprive people of such beautiful body parts. This school used to be the city's music chapel, hosted a major music competition, and produced many musical geniuses. The officer recalled that the second victim was a music professor at the college and had good piano skills. It was also interesting that the first victim lost her arm while driving to a concert, the guy thought when he called his assistant. Li Weini was at the police station at the time, always ready to help the senior officer on the case. What the assistant heard puzzled her. She didn't think it would be necessary to check whether the victims played the piano. The boy believed that if both victims played musical instruments, then most likely the third was also involved in music. The young man's phone rang loudly, disturbing other parents who had come to listen to the concert. Zhou Yu answered the call. He knew that there were new leads on the important case, the hand thief. The young man spoke loudly as he left the hall, which prevented others from listening to the music. They could not understand how one could be so impolite. The junior police officer told the guy that the first victim, Gao Tian, was on her way to the piano concert. This news was almost like hitting the jackpot. Because of the guy's behavior, other parents thought that his child was also ill-mannered and did not do well in school, but he was seen with Zhang Xiaoqing, who was among the top 3 graduates of her year. Everyone in the room was stunned by the girl's success, but the detective was only interested in the second victim, Luo Mina. All 3 victims studied piano in the 10th grade, but took the exams in different years, so the hero felt it was necessary to study their school history. The officer thought that if the attacks were out of revenge, then the attacker must have known that all the victims played the piano, which meant that she could play too. The only thing that didn't fit into the puzzle was that the victims were asked if they knew other victims, but they didn't know each other. If the victims did not know each other, it was unknown whether they could have met the criminal. The detective recalled that during the concert, the pianist told how 20 years ago she took part in a music competition at this school. An unexpected guess beamed from Zhuo Yua. They might have known each other through the competition. The culprit was an incredible pianist, but she lost to the victims and then began to hate them. At this time, she decided to take revenge on all her offenders. While the detective was talking on the phone, the school principal took the floor, but the officer was speaking too loudly and was disturbing him. The head of the educational institution was dismissed because someone interrupted his speech. The boy was overjoyed by the news that his assistant told him. It turned out that all 3 victims had participated in a city piano competition among high school students, and they all made it to the finals. But that was not all. That the next thing the guy found out shocked him. The competition was taking place in the very school where he was now. The director of the educational institution could no longer tolerate this impudence. He flew out into the corridor to deal with the impudent woman. The unexpected appearance of the head of the educational institution was even to the officer's advantage, since he needed a list of participants in a competition among pianists that had taken place 10 years ago. The detective already had a premonition that he would soon catch the criminal. She must certainly be on the same list. The staff of the archive of secondary school No. 2 were looking for the necessary materials. The workers tried to stop the guy from searching for the 20-year-old video because it could be a waste of time. They could have been destroyed long ago, but he was in no hurry. Zhou Yu was reading a book. He wanted to wait until the video was found, and he had enough time for this. The workers thought it was hard labor and did not understand how much more old materials they would have to sort through to find the right one. Suddenly, the young man received a call from his assistant, who said that she had found a list of the competition participants. The detective grinned. He could already feel how he was almost fastening the handcuffs on the criminal's wrists. A junior police officer and her boyfriend arrived at the home of Zhao Shan, a participant who took 10th place in the competition. The woman said that the jury consisted of teachers from famous music universities. The top 3 were chosen by famous schools, and all the other places were the most ordinary educational institutions. Anyone below 6th place, like Zhao Shan, was treated as an ordinary examinee, while the first 5 places were elite, and only the very best could get into them. Perhaps because of this competition, the criminal was forced to live a life she did not want at all. The blonde clutched the list of participants in her hand. She believed that Zhao Shan, who came in last place, was the murderer. The woman's belly was too big for her to return to the crime scene and separate her hands. The detective listened carefully to his assistant. Since the evil causer was not on the list of finalists, the police will have to check all the participants. The guy smiled. It was a really great idea. And so he decided to shift this difficult task onto the shoulders of his younger colleague. The assistant thought that her elder was saying this only to laugh at her, but he was already impatient to catch the culprit. Li Weini thought that the guy had changed a lot lately. He used to act completely differently. In his past life, the young man was a gangster, which he recently remembered and has not yet completely gotten used to the life of a policeman. But the assistant had something completely different in mind. Bags under the eyes that had appeared recently as a result of stress. The girl was worried about the senior officer and thought that he should rest more. Perhaps a break would actually help the guy figure out what to do next, since it looked like they were moving in the right direction. The system reminded of itself again. It informed that the collision was completed with a degree of 88%. The detective received a universal key that can open any lock and a 6-digit password. The protagonist wondered if the parent-teacher meetings and the clues could be connected and needed to return home and try to activate the system again. The policeman said goodbye. They both needed to rest, so they agreed to meet the next day at the station. Zhou Yu was sure that if the criminal was in action like last year, there would be 3 days between victims, so she should appear tomorrow. The detective smiled predatorily, as if he could smell the blood and would definitely catch this young lady. At 5 in the morning, the guy was awakened by some unexpected loud sounds outside his apartment. Jiang Shaoqing was knocking on the door. She knew that the owner of the apartment was inside because she heard a loud cough at night. The guy guessed that the girl came to him so early because of the unsuccessful parent-teacher meeting. The boy told the school principal that he was a police officer and was investigating a hand snatcher case, which was possibly connected to a piano competition that had once been held at the school. The situation was bad because the young lady was in a very bad mood, which threatened the guy with serious trouble. The hero got out of bed, but opening the door was not in his plans at all. Zhou Yu thought that competing under the bed would be a good idea. Perhaps the girl wouldn't be able to find him there. Jiang Shaoqing was not going to stop at anything if the young man did not open the door. She planned to do it herself. The girl entered the room, which looked completely empty, not even inhabited, abandoned. She walked and checked every corner. Not a single centimeter of the room escaped her attention. Finally, the young lady looked under the bed and realized that the guy was not in the room after all. The girl couldn't understand where the owner of the room had gone. Jiang Shaoqing didn't find the brunette on the balcony either. He had fallen through the ground. The young lady slammed the door in anger. She would definitely get to her accomplice who didn't keep his promises. All this time, Zhou Yu waited on the balcony of the neighboring apartment for the girl to leave his territory. The guy almost forgot that the girl was his landlady and had keys to all the apartments, but he finally realized it in time. What the detective did not expect at all was that the young brunette locked the door to the balcony. It was unclear why she needed to do this. The hero thought about a plan on how to get into the apartment and decided to try through the next one. Maybe he could get out. The policeman recalled that when he moved in, the owner of the house told him that 4 beautiful ladies lived next to him. The guy jumped onto the balcony of his neighbor, who worked at night. He had already almost gotten used to this method of movement. It was now 5 o'clock in the morning, and therefore there should be no people in the apartment. Zhou Yu calmly looked around and headed towards the exit of the room. The blonde was leaving the bathroom. She thought she was at home alone. Horror was reflected on the guy's face. He didn't think he would be caught red-handed. The girl began to scream loudly, but the hero covered her mouth with his hand. He could not allow everyone to come running to her scream. The detective realized that this time he could be in big trouble. He could not prove his innocence. The guy was lucky. The girl recognized him as the police officer who had recently saved her. The young man was already familiar with this lady, having once freed her from the hands of a rapist. This was the same blonde he met in a bar, and who was later attacked by the electric shock maniac Pososhok. Zhou Yu explained that he lived next door and was accidentally locked on the balcony. And since he thought no one was home, he decided to go through the girl's apartment. The lady lit a cigarette. This meeting was a surprise for both of them. Usually the blonde was still working at such a time, but the events of the recent past left a deep mark on her heart. That's why the beauty decided to take a break and rest, she told the guy. Exhaling acrid smoke from a cigarette, the girl smiled mysteriously. There was something that had been on the girl's mind all this time. The blonde moved closer to the guy and asked how he knew that it was she who would be the target of an assassination attempt that night. The officer replied that there was not a single pretty girl in the bar that night, and it seemed the rapist thought the same. The beauty unexpectedly pushed the detective onto the bed. She didn't expect that Officer Zhao could be quite romantic and say such sweet compliments. The blonde sat down next to the guy and said that her neighbor would only return in the afternoon. The lady's cheeks flushed, but she knew that such a chance came very rarely, in fact, once in a lifetime. The conversation between the young people was interrupted by the loud ringing of a mobile phone. The phone's wallpaper featured its owner, but that wasn't what confused the detective. She was playing the piano. The beauty did not understand why the guy cooled down so suddenly and his mood changed. But the young man needed to know more about the photograph. The girl decided to say that the photo was taken back when she was in school. The detective moved closer to the beauty's face, his only interest being whether the blonde could play the piano. The young lady took her phone from the hero and said that her mother forced her to learn to play as soon as she started talking. The biggest shock for the policeman was that the beauty even took part in the competition held at secondary school number 2. Zhao Yu pinned the girl to the bed. He urgently needed to know which competition she was participating in. The beauty answered the detective's questions without suspecting anything. It was tournament number 10. The guy smiled, and that's when the criminal also took part. The young man continued asking questions. He needed to know if the girl was familiar with the names Gao Tian, Yuan Lili, or Luo Mena. The girl was not familiar with the finalists. She was not such a beautiful pianist because she could not even get into the top 20. The beauty did not understand why the officer would leave her with these questions. She hoped to do something much more interesting than interrogations. Zhao Yuhiza smiled and asked if his interlocutor had ever heard of an arm thief. The blonde knew what the young man was talking about. Everyone was talking about this matter. It seriously scared her. The detective wasn't going to stop, so he reported that all the victims were participating in the same competition as the girl. Fear froze on the lady's face. She didn't want to be on the maniacs list, but now all the victims turned out to be finalists, so she shouldn't worry. The brunette hugged the beauty tightly, trying to calm her down. He was hoping for some details that would help to arrest the criminal faster. If the girl remembered correctly, then something strange did indeed happen at the competition. After talking with the neighbor, the policeman left to share the news with his junior colleague. The guy managed to find out that this year the competition included a musical prodigy named Li Dan, who was only 12 years old, but the day before the final, she unexpectedly gave in to everyone. The partner was afraid that someone might have bribed Li to give up and not take first place. Zhao Yu said that he heard that the child prodigy's family was indeed very poor, and they even had to sell their own house to pay for their daughter's piano lessons. The young man did not believe that the girl could just show up, because this was her only chance and she would not agree no matter how much money was offered. The guy knew that this was an elite competition, and if he got into the top 3, his life would change dramatically, so something went wrong during it. The assistant didn't know what to do, because after the competition, Li Dan's family seemed to disappear into thin air. The detective smiled. He knew the best professional in finding missing people, and it was to him that they were now going. The blonde understood that they were talking about Zhang Jingfeng, but she was afraid that his help might be too expensive. Li Wei's words greatly surprised Zhao Yu, because the specialist worked for the police. The assistant explained that the guy they were going to see was always looking for his own benefit, and the department didn't like him for that and even nicknamed him Sly Eel. The new information only made the officer even more interested, and he pressed the gas pedal to the floor, picking up speed. The detective's arrival did not go unnoticed. Everyone knew who was in the room. The missing person's professional smiled. He couldn't understand why the police had come to their home. The brunette smiled. He felt at home among such people. The assistant interrupted the men's conversation. She disappeared because of these stupid questions, because everyone knew the reason for their visit. A few hours before the meeting, the detective called Zhang Jingfeng and said that he was looking for a person, but he said that he could not talk on the phone and invited the brunette to his place. Now the officer looked closely at his interlocutor and expected pleasant news for himself. The blonde guy was having fun. He didn't understand why he was in such a hurry. The game of billiards had just begun. The junior police officer retreated. She didn't like the environment or the people around them. Zhang Jingfeng invited the hero to join a new game of billiards. He was not at all in the mood to discuss any business now. Zhao Yu asked the guy what the stakes would be and how many moves he could make. The cunning Loach allowed the detective to hit as many times as he wanted. The young man smiled. He had received exactly the answer he had hoped for. There was a crunching sound throughout the room as a wooden cue broke on the corner of the pool table. The officer held a piece of wood in his hands. This was his first blow. With the second blow, the guy broke the blonde's cue over his knees, followed by the third and fourth moves. The huge man grabbed Zhao Yua by the shirt. He didn't like the young man's behavior. The detective repelled the giant with one blow. The smell from the bastard's mouth was very unpleasant for him. Another sharp movement of the foot from the hero and the big guy was already sitting bent over at the other end of the room. Bug really didn't like that the guy was using illegal techniques, and he ordered the other gang members to grab him. 3 serious-looking men with sticks were approaching the police. The brunette ordered his assistant to hide behind his back and not interfere. He was confident that he could handle the situation himself. A devilish light lit up the guy's eyes. It just so happened that he hadn't had a good warm-up with live opponents for a long time. The young man didn't even break a sweat as he knocked out the bandits and was now approaching their leader. Zhang Jingfeng decided not to tempt fate and still talked to the detective about the case. Zhao Ayu was pleased with the current situation and even promised to pay for his new friend's dinner in the future. The cunning Loach refused the hero's offer. He was always ready to help the police. Following the instructions of a human search specialist, the police arrived at the home of the Li Dan family. Zhang Jingfeng quickly dealt with the search for the family because no matter what they called themselves now, everything was in the medical records. There were no people who were not sick. 15 years ago, Li Dan's father had to go to the hospital several times due to a heart attack, and last year her mother was hospitalized due to a tumor, so the family was unable to leave the city. The detective knew the area where the girl lived because about 100 meters from this street, the incident with the third victim occurred. Perhaps it was because the criminal lived nearby that she managed to bypass all the surveillance cameras. Zhao Yua couldn't understand how she could just carry someone else's limbs home. The police knocked on the door of the apartment whose address Sly Loach had obtained for them. The apartment was locked, so could it be that the guy had made a mistake somewhere and they were already expected? Or had the suspect already left the city? When the guy was about to enter the room without an invitation, a female silhouette appeared from behind the door. An old woman, a coffee woman, opened the door, barely able to stand on her feet and not understanding why she had been disturbed. The blonde started the conversation, showed her police ID, and asked if Li Dan lived in this house. She invited the young men to her home and offered them drinks. As it turned out, she was the mother of the girl they were looking for. The young man turned halfway back to the women and asked if the woman's daughter had played the piano. The mother said that the musical instrument was taboo in their family, and after her husband's death, they never mentioned it. Dan Dan, as her mother called her, was always a very talented child and won many competitions on numerous occasions. And 10 years ago, she took 3rd place in the penultimate round of the secondary school Nobatu competition. Li Dan felt that the difference between her and the other participants was small, so she decided to increase the difficulty in the final, where the pianists themselves were allowed to choose what to play. The day before the final, at the last minute, the sponsors organized a practice for the competition participants. When everyone left, the girl stayed to practice and was very threatening in playing the instrument. The music captured every cell of her. Something happened that no one could have expected. The child's eyes widened in horror, and tears began to roll from them. A terrible pain gripped the girl's body. She bent in half, holding her right hand. The piano keys were stained red with Li Dan's blood. The doctor told the parents that their child's middle finger had been cut off by a sharp object. Part of the finger could still be reattached, but it needed to be found as quickly as possible. For a girl whose only life was the piano, this was almost a death sentence, so her father retreated back to the high school classroom. The blood had already been washed off the musical instrument, and part of Li Dan's finger was gone forever. The sponsors were afraid that this tragedy would somehow have a bad effect on other participants, so they tried to hide everything until the end of the competition. And after it was too late, the police couldn't find anything. All that was known was that the finger had been cut off by a sharp blade that someone had placed between the black and white keys. This spot on the piano was rarely used, but the piece he chose made Dan Dan press this spot very hard. After physical therapy and her arm recovered, Li Dan couldn't stop shaking every time she saw the piano. The woman also managed to tell through tears that shortly after this, Her husband had a heart attack and was hospitalized. He died soon after, and her daughter was left traumatized not only physically, but also emotionally. The young man listened very attentively to the woman's story, and all the facts came together to form a single picture. The only thing left to do in this case was to find evidence of the girl's guilt and capture her. The guy noticed a room with a heavy lock on the door. The woman suddenly became agitated and said that this room belonged to her daughter. Now the girl has left to perform with the troupe in the villages, and she should not be back for the next few days. Zhao Yu mentioned that the film used in victim number 3's car was also used in the theater to stage various performances. The detective did not hide from the woman that Li Dan was involved in their case, and that much evidence could have been in her room. The guy said someone was targeting the woman's daughter, shocking both the mother and his partner. The guy said that perhaps this was the work of the same person who once placed a blade between the keys to open the room's door with the key the system gave him. The older woman did not want to let anyone into her daughter's room. She was very afraid that she would get angry when she found out that someone had gone in there. The officer assured that he would do everything for the girl's safety and leave the room as if no one had ever been there. The door opened and the young man took the first step. Something unexpected and frightening appeared from the bedroom. Something that terrified me to the depths of my heart. It was a terrible skeleton. The frightened junior police officer threw herself on the young man's neck. It turned out to be ordinary medical equipment, often used in educational institutions. The detective reassured his assistant. He said that she had simply imagined it and that she could not see anything terrible in the room. The owner of the house entered the room and turned on the light. She did not understand why the blonde was so scared. The guy saw a few more that caught his attention. There were books on the shelves about anesthetics and excisions. The hero asked the woman if her daughter had studied medicine, but she replied that she had not, although she had worked for some time in a veterinary clinic. The detective remembered the tests that showed that Luo Ming had been given inhalation, 2 types of anesthetics, and an intravenous injection, and one of the anesthetics was an animal tranquilizer. Zhao Yua was very surprised that there was no table in the room. The guy lifted the bed mattress while his assistant assured the woman that they weren't looking for anything specific, but just wanted to see what was what. The young man turned the bed back into place, telling the women who found it everything he was looking for in the room. The guy smiled his most charming smile and asked the head of the family to wait in the hallway so that he and his colleague could take a couple of pictures of the evidence he had found. The woman was still worried about her daughter, but the detective assured her that the department would keep a close eye on her. Li Wayne sighed heavily. She didn't understand why the elder continued to lie to this sweet young lady. What the assistant saw in bed caused her genuine horror. All the evidence the police were looking for, as well as the stolen body parts, were kept under Li Dan's mattress. Finally, the detective found the criminal, although for some reason this did not make him happy. The assistant was delighted with the guy's genius because he figured out that all the clues should be looked for in the room. The young man thought that shouting at the door to the room was very strange and suspicious on the part of the criminal. Another couple learned that Li Dan's right arm was damaged in the same way as the other victims, and that her mother had undergone surgery in May, just after 2 separate arm-severing incidents. 9 months later, when the mother's condition had returned to normal, she took on a third crime and all the missing evidence is now lying before the police. Under the bed was a pile of pictures of places, crimes, and victims. She prepared all this to leave women's hands. Zhao Yu now saw a clear picture of these atrocities in front of him. That day, the 24th, Li Dan was at the same concert as the first victim, Gao Tian, and after it was over, the criminal followed her. The villainess then disabled the victim and dragged him into the utility room. Having separated the hand from the body, the pianist did not immediately leave the crime scene. She placed the end in a solution with formalin and hid it. Li Dan returned back only after 2 months. She sat in the ventilation until dawn or to pick up the jar. The girl then made her way through a ventilation pipe into the gym, where she was able to blend into the crowd and leave the building unnoticed. The criminal waited until the night of the 25th on the roof of the house. Using a stepladder, the blonde climbed up to the roof of Yuan Lily's home. Li Dan used a rope to climb down from the roof to the second victim's balcony to gain entry into the apartment. The villain made duplicate keys to the apartment in the morning and also installed a listening device, so they knew for sure that Yuan Lily would be home alone that day. When the girl fell asleep, the criminal snuck into her bedroom and left her hands. After everything she had done, Li Dan lay underground for 7 whole days. The detective was sure that the villain had even prepared a toilet pot so as not to leave any traces behind her. The assistant was saddened by how much hatred Li Dan felt towards her victims. When one person took her hand away, and now she was taking revenge on everyone she thought could be involved. The only thing that didn't fit into the picture was the photo of the water pistol. The detective couldn't understand why it might be needed. Among other things, there was also a photograph of an excavated grave under the bed, but so far, the police did not know who it belonged to or who dug it up. The assistant also noticed something that excited her greatly. The girl was eager to share her discovery with her elder. Under the bed, a photo of Xiao Jiaying, an international trade company that had recently moved to Australia, could be seen. The guy didn't understand why Li Dan was collecting so much information about this person. But then it dawned on him that third place in the competition was taken by a girl named Xiao Lulu. Zhao Yu realized that the businesswoman was the next victim. The girl was returning to the city today at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, as noted on the plane ticket. The detective looked at his phone. The clock showed more than 4 o'clock. Xiao Jiaying's plane should have landed in the city already. The hero ran out of the apartment. He urgently had to find Li Dan and ordered his assistant to photograph all the evidence on camera and quickly go to the department for reinforcements. The assistant managed to check the information. Xiao Jiaying really turned out to be the girl who took third place in the competition. The blonde also learned that the girl was accepted into the National Conservatory of Folk Music, where she began working in the field of musical equipment and became a famous entrepreneur, after which she changed her name. While the detective was listening to his colleague's report, he was already rushing to the car. He urgently needed to find the criminal. The assistant couldn't understand why the elder was in such a hurry, because the girl, formerly known as Xiao Lulu, now lived in Australia. He guessed that the dug grave from the photograph belonged to the businessman's father. Li Dan had deliberately dug a hole there. After this, the criminal sent the pictures to Xiao Lulu, who said that her father's grave had collapsed for no reason in order to lure her into the city and leave her hands. Li Weini didn't understand where the elder was going to look for women. The car had already set off. The newly minted Australian's plane had landed an hour ago, and the detective was in a hurry to find her. Xiao Jiaying stood in the cemetery next to her father's dug-up grave. The woman was approaching from behind with a retribution in the form of Li Dan with an axe. Li Weini called to report that the criminal's phone could not be traced, so the detective told them to find Xiao Lulu. Zhao Yu rushed through the red light at breakneck speed, and his assistant was unable to locate the victim so quickly. The young man was completely focused on the matter and did not pay attention to the road at all. The hero realized that if Xiao Lulu had come only on business, then he needed to look for her in the cemetery. There were no surveillance cameras at the grave, making it the perfect place to deliver the final blow. The car sped past pedestrians on a red light. The grandmother and grandson, who were crossing the road at the time, noticed that the driver was very bad and the police should catch him. Xiao Lulu lay unconscious in the cemetery near her father's grave. Li Dan stood over the girl with an axe in her hands. The detective arrived in time and loudly ordered the criminal to stop and put down the weapon. The girl did not expect that anyone would see her, and the appearance of the young man shocked her. The pianist started running across the cemetery, but the officer was in good physical shape and did not lag behind her even a step. Every time the young man thought he was about to grab the girl, she moved away from him again. Zhao Yui's face was sweating. His breathing was labored, and he was already very tired. Li Dan crashed into the wall. No matter how fast she ran, she still couldn't fly. There were no wings on her back. The detective took handcuffs out of his pocket. He gloated over the girl's difficult situation. The guy found this situation very funny. The criminal went over various escape options in her head as the policeman approached her. When Li Dan turned around, she had a gun in her hands, which she did not hesitate to use. What the young man didn't expect was that an arrow would fly from his water pistol. Now the guy understood why the girl kept the photo of the child's weapon among other evidence. The young man's eyes closed. The whole world became cloudy. The criminal shot him with a sleeping pill, and the last thing he saw was him running from the crime scene. The hero fell face down on the road, unconscious. The first thing Zhao Yu heard was a good female voice, belonging to the doctor Wang Fei. She said that the dosage was very small and the guy should quickly come to his senses. A few seconds later, he saw the owner of this voice. The policeman opened his eyes. His consciousness was clouded. He did not understand where he was, where the criminal had gone. All this still needed to be figured out. The young man tried to rise, but his legs were still weak, and the doctor and Li Weini were afraid that the effects of the sleeping pill were still not wearing off. The detective's head began to spin again. The whole world began to shake. Sweat appeared on his forehead. He could barely keep his body upright. The boy was bent into Wang Fei's embrace. Zhao Yu fell, pinning the doctor to the ground with his body. The assistant was very worried about her colleague, but the young man finally came to his senses. The guy looked in surprise at the girl he landed on. She was an incredible beauty. The lady looked languidly at the young man, holding out her hand to him. Zhao Yu took the young lady's upper end in his own and helped the woman up. Wang Fei said as she stood up that she heard that there was a new hooligan detective in the department, but she didn't expect to see him on a call today. The detective, with a maximally neutral expression on his face, apologized to the doctor for the incident that had occurred. The guy finally remembered where he was and what he was doing there. His eyes widened in horror. The young man turned to the junior police officer and loudly asked where Xiao Lulu was and what had happened to her hand. The hero heard the answer from a completely different side and in a male voice. Acting Brigade Commander Liu Zhanghu wanted to know why the officer didn't attach all the evidence at once, because if the killer escaped the city, then everyone would be in trouble. A blonde woman defended Zhao Yua, saying that the evidence had been obtained recently, but there were still doubts about its authenticity. The doctor intervened in the conversation and said that if the detective had not arrived in time, the businesswoman would have lost her arm and the young man would have been hit with a dart with a stinging agent. To everyone's surprise, the guy burst into laughter. The detective reminded that he and the commander had bet that the guy would catch the criminal on his own and would definitely win the monitor. To the surprise of everyone present, the heroes went in the opposite direction from the exit from the cemetery. The guy knew exactly what he was doing. He walked up to the grave and kicked it with all his might. A large hole opened up under the young man, into which he fell. Everyone who was nearby rushed to the cliff. They were very afraid for the policeman. Underground, Zhao Yu sat with the criminal and asked her to take a photo by heart. A pair of handcuffs were fastened on Li Dan's hands. The pianist was escorted out of the cemetery under guard, which pleased Li Weini very much, although the detective did not share her enthusiasm. The junior police officer was very interested in how the senior officer was able to figure out where the criminal was. The guy couldn't tell that before he lost consciousness. He attached an invisible tracking device that the system gave him to the killer. The detective hypothesized that the last time Li Dan hid on the roof of the building for 7 days, and apparently she didn't go too far this time either. But this did not explain how the guy himself found out which particular grave the girl was hiding in. The young man knew exactly which grave to look in, and the assistant was very proud of herself for noticing this fact. Li Weini believed that the hero did not lose consciousness at all and saw everything with his own eyes. Zhao Yu smiled madly. He was very pleased with the policeman's deductive abilities. The system reported that the meeting was over and the detective received 5 invisible lie detectors, recording 10 minutes long. The completion rate was very high. The invisible tracking device was very helpful this time, and the lie detector will definitely come in handy too. The detective thoughtfully tapped his index finger on his lower limb. The system of lucky chances was activated today. She said that thunder follows lightning, but only together they split everything in two and make all 5 elements rage. The detective sat opposite the killer and wondered if the system had been sending hints about this particular meeting. Li Dan didn't raise her head or look at the guy. The only thing she was interested in was who exactly it was. Zhao Yu didn't quite understand the pianist's question. He had no idea what she was asking. The girl hit the table with her hand, which was missing part of a finger, wondering who did this to her. The prisoner had the right to know who put the blade in the piano back then. The policeman realized that the criminal did not know the name of the culprit and cut off everyone's hands. Li Dan was angry. Her life was ruined that day, and everyone who made it to the finals was to blame. The criminal thought that one of the 3 victims had already confessed to harming her because it was the only way to track her down. The detective looked at the girl. It was too presumptuous of her to think that the police had no other way to get to her except for the victims confessing to the attack. The young man told the pianist that he had found a connection between all 3 victims. They had taken part in the same competition as her. And then he had simply found her house. Anger overwhelmed the girl with renewed vigor. It was impossible. Even if the guy found out about her, he would never be able to find out where she lived. The hospitalization records of his mother helped Zhao Yu find the culprit. But that still didn't explain how he found the grave she had hidden in. The sweat appeared on the guy's forehead. He couldn't admit that he had touched an invisible tracking device on the girl, so he simply said that the anesthesia had worn off earlier. The anger had gone, and all that was left for Li Dan was disappointment. It was impossible. All her efforts were in vain. There was silence in the office. The young people did not know what else to add. The guy answered all the questions. The girl was the first to speak. She admitted that her father had placed all his hopes on her. Tears streamed down the killer's face. She was incapable of anything. Her father was dead, and her mother had cancer. There was nothing left in her life. Chao Yu looked at the woman and listened to her story, but his face showed no emotion. The young man rose from the table. The interrogation was over. All the questions had been asked. The guy headed for the exit, but stopped because there was one more thing he wanted to say. Without turning around, the boy asked if Li Dan thought about her mother before taking revenge. Tears streamed down the criminal's face. How could her mother survive if the girl was not there, and who would take care of her? Li Dan closed her eyes, the full weight of her crimes falling on her shoulders. The wall of hatred that protected her heart fell. Before finally walking out the door, the hero said that a person's heart cannot lose its balance and hatred cannot cross the line. After talking with the prisoner, the detective was overcome by a wave of anger. The officers walked down the corridor. He realized that the one who had damaged Li Dan was still somewhere. In the middle of the office, the detective came across his assistant and a pack of angry men who were clearly waiting for the guy. One of the visitors noticed a young man approaching the group. The largest of the men approached the hero, flexing his fists. The group had clearly been waiting for the young man to arrive, and now they had found him. Zhao Yua's face was expressionless as the leader gave the order to take him. The guy threw the health to the other end of the room. The angry squad leader ordered the young man to stop. These were representatives of the merchants from Yuxi Alley, whose goods were destroyed by the guy with the camel, and they came to get compensation. The officer couldn't understand what they were talking about. The young man's visitors looked more like the petty extortionists he had seen so much of in his past life than like the unfortunate salesman. Chao Yu grabbed the chief by the ear, holding the note with the compensation amount in his hand. He wanted to teach them something. The detective wanted to know where such a large sum came from. Since he had not caused any physical harm and since the group had come to him, they should have at least correctly stated their demands. A devilish light lit up the guy's eyes. He could condemn the men for such slander. Someone called the hero by name, distracting everyone from the extortionists. Xiao Lulu came to the police station. She wanted to give the detective 100,000 yuan as a token of gratitude for saving him. The girl was very grateful and, in addition to the monetary reward, also wanted to have dinner with the guy. The offer was very small. The detective's money would not be superfluous, but Liu Zhanghu forbade the young man to accept such gifts. The guy refused to go to dinner. This was against all the rules of the police station, so they should not meet. But regarding the money, Zhao Yu asked the girl to write a voluntary donation to avoid problems in the future. The businesswoman looked closely at the hero who saved her hand. She agreed to all the boy's conditions. Under the envious glances of her colleagues and Liu Zhanghu, the woman showed the young man her business card. The girl said goodbye to the police and told the guy to call at any time if he needed help. While the detective was busy, the extortionists hoped to quietly slip away unnoticed. The men's escape turned into a terrible failure. The guy heard movement behind him. Chao Yu grabbed the scoundrel by the hair and handed him a stack of bills, ordering him to give the money to the aggrieved merchants. The pack of men promised that they would do everything as the guy told them, and all the sellers would get their deserved fate. The men quickly left the police station. They had done their job and did not want to interfere anymore. The detective turned to his colleagues and promised to treat them to a delicious dinner after work. The police were delighted at the prospect of free, tasty food and a fun vacation with the newly rich man. Zhao Yu looked at the board with Li Dan's photo when he was detained and knew that he couldn't leave the matter hanging. While looking at the list of finalists of the 10th music competition, the young man broke out in a cold sweat. He finally understood who had put the blade in the piano. Who was the real monster in that terrible story? The detective sat at a table with a cup of coffee, and in front of him were the results of the same ill-fated competition. The boy knew that only 4 people had any benefit from Li Dan leaving the competition, but only one had any reason to harm. Xiao Lulu was shocked by the officer's statement and believed that if even one of the 3 victims had been guilty, the criminal would have been caught long ago and the matter would not have reached his interlocutor. The businesswoman was outraged by what she heard. Did her hero really think that she could somehow harm the girl, since she was just a victim who they wanted to cut off her arm? The guy looked closely at Xiao Lulu and asked if she had ruined Li Dan's life. Fear and shock mixed in the girl's eyes. She never expected to hear such a straightforward question in her life. When the young man told the businessman the name of the criminal, there was no doubt that she knew in advance who wanted to attack her. And she also remembered what happened at that competition. The girl denied her involvement in the events of the past, But the detective checked her personal data and discovered that in order for her to take part in the competition, her father forged documents. They were capable of much for the sake of the final. Bogatirka also took part in the ninth competition, but was unable to reach the finals, and the 10th was her last hope. She is the only one of the four finalists who had a motive. The former musician demanded evidence because without it, Zhao Yua's words sounded like empty accusations that proved absolutely nothing. The businesswoman herself knew that if it weren't for the blade, the life of the current prisoner would be the same as the girl's, if not better. The young man said that now Li Dan was left without a father, and her mother had cancer. The girl's soul was entwined with hatred and she would not last long. The interlocutor was shaking. The feeling of guilt was eating her up from the inside. She could no longer listen to this story about her former rival. Tears appeared in Xiao Lulu's eyes. No one could even imagine how she lived all these years with a terrible secret. With her actions, she remained only. Zhao Yu had hoped for recognition, but the girl had long lived with the inevitable shadow of her past peeking out from around the corner every second. The boy handed the businessman a paper handkerchief so that he could wipe away his tears. The girl admitted that she was indeed involved in this case, but this was only part of the truth. 18 years ago, the day before the competition, Xiao Lulu, on orders from the committee, rehearsed until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then went to her room so as not to disturb the other contestants. In the evening, the young pianist's father said that he had forgotten something in the hotel lobby and had to return there urgently. The future entrepreneur wanted to leave with her husband, but he strictly ordered her to stay at home and not go anywhere. Dad very rarely spoke to the girl in a raised voice, and therefore that day she could not fall asleep until her very worried father returned. When the day of the award ceremony came, Xiao Lulu was very worried and decided to go to the toilet. Then she saw Li Dan's mother arguing with the committee members, begging them to do something. Only then did the musician learn that the main contender for victory had dropped out of the competition, and all because of a blade inside the piano. Having quickly put the facts together, the young lady realized that the time of the event coincided with the time when her father left the room. The girl took third place in the competition, but she couldn't get rid of even a small smile. This event didn't make her happy at all. The young lady hoped with all her heart that her father was not involved in the events that happened to Li Dan. But her hope was fading with each passing second. On the day the family was packing their bags, the daughter found a whole box of special blades in her father's bag, which caused a huge fight between them. The father confessed to all his sins. He begged her not to tell anyone anything because he only wanted the best for his daughter. Xiao Lulu's parents divorced when he was still a child, and her father was the only one who worried about his daughter. He was ready to do anything for her. The man sometimes had to work 3 jobs and did not even have time to sleep so that his little girl could have the best life. The businesswoman did not want her father to go to prison. She was very worried about him and was afraid of the consequences for herself. Carmana caught up with the man and soon he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, after which he soon died. And the girl at least was not involved, but the feeling of guilt remained with her forever and will haunt her all her life. The officer listened to the whole story with a stern expression on his face. The pianist told him that she never sat down at a musical instrument again. Her conscience did not allow her. Bogatirka promised to hire the best lawyers to protect Li Dan and also take care of her mother. The guy was still listening and looking at the woman with a condemning look. Nothing could compensate for the harm done. Xiao Lulu knew that money couldn't solve all problems, and she didn't expect the criminal to forgive her. She just wanted the girl's life not to get any worse. Finally, Zhao Yuyi was satisfied with what he heard. He solved the case and achieved maximum justice for the victim. The young people sat silently in the establishment and finished their coffee until they each went their separate ways. In the evening, the young man, as promised, took his colleagues to have fun at a karaoke bar. It had been a hard week and they deserved it. Everyone heard that the guy stole 2 big cases from Team B and the police were not only pleased because the best detective was now among them. While the boy was singing, his gaze was drawn to something special, namely a beautiful girl. Wang Fei sat at the far end of the sofa with a drink in her hand. She was especially beautiful that evening. The hero was very proud of himself. He sang very well, and he also did not forget to glance at the beauty, and he incredibly liked what was revealed to his gaze. Before everyone left, Li Vaney proposed a final toast to the solved case and the remarkable detective. The white BMW drove away from the restaurant, taking guests home. Wang Fei, who was driving the car, was worried about her passenger. She wondered if the young man had drunk too much this evening during the celebrations. The guy smiled. If he had exceeded his dose, He would have been picking on the beauty with kisses a long time ago. The doctor was surprised by the detective's straightforwardness. She was even a little amused by this situation. The girl even admitted that her house was completely on the other side of the guy's house. The officer was worried about what he heard because if they were not on the same path, then the beauty's motives were unclear. Perhaps she needed something from Zhao Yue. The doctor immediately realized that the hero's thoughts were moving in the worst possible direction. Wang Fei told the young man that a body had been pulled out of the Q reservoir today, and in order to attend the celebration, she had to leave half of her work for the evening. But now she was returning there. The young man was surprised by the girl's appetite since she had only finished half of the dissection and seemed to be a professional in her field. The doctor asked if the detective still wanted to kiss her, since she had touched countless dead people with her hands. The guy didn't care because people didn't become dead after the girl's touch. In addition, the young man said that if he had died at the hands of such a magical lady, he would have had no complaints, which greatly embarrassed the driver. The beauty smiled. She liked the flirting of this self-confident young man. There was something primordial about him. The car stopped moving when the girl pressed the brake pedal, and the couple reached their destination. Without saying a word, Zhao Yu began to get out of the car, under the beauty's gaze. Still not turning to face the girl, the young man said that he had no one at home, hinting at a pleasant continuation of the evening with just the two of them. Finally, looking at the young woman, the young man invited her to come visit. He even added that he could pretend to be dead if the beauty wanted to improve her body skills. Wang Fei smiled at the hero, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. She considered the guy's proposal for a few seconds. The car with the doctor moved very quickly, almost knocking the policeman off his feet with a gust of wind. It seems he got his answer. The young man smiled shyly as he stood on a pedestrian crossing in the middle of the street and dreamily looked after the girl. Zhao Yu recalled how just a few seconds ago he had confidently invited the doctor to come to him and sit for a while over a cup of tea. The girl refused, but promised that the next time she brought her surgical knife, the young people would definitely make up for the lost time, and perhaps even more. The detective was going up to his apartment when he heard a strange sound that shouldn't have been there. At the top of the stairs, a young person, well known to him, was waiting for the young man. Fear gripped the young man's body, and there was a lump in his throat. The guy could not find the words. The encounter he had seen had shocked him. Zhang Shaoqing sat and ate an apple. She had been waiting for a young man for a long time who had been very difficult to find recently. The young lady stood up, her every movement filled with anger at the guy who was having a good time while she was looking for him everywhere. Zhao Yu smiled sheepishly. He tried to explain to his friend that he was very busy with the investigation. The student's anger reached a new level. How could the boy forget what he did at the parent-teacher meeting? Tears came to the young lady's eyes. She wanted to earn some money to help her family cover their expenses. The girl did not understand whether her request was so difficult that the young man decided to set her up, although the girl trusted him very much. Zhang Shaoqing cried even harder, turning away. If everyone knew what she was doing, then she would no longer be able to study. The hero's heart melted at the sight of his sobbing girlfriend. He wanted to somehow help the situation and help in a difficult situation. The girl's face dried from tears, and joy shone in her eyes from the fact that the guy agreed to come to her rescue. The next day, the student arranged for her teacher to visit her at home, and the detective was to pose as her father again, but this time the young lady would be in control herself. The older man said that it was time for high school exams soon, and Zhang Shaoqing was one of the top students, so the guy, as a father, had to take good care of his daughter. With just his gaze, the policeman asked his accomplice if her dad would suddenly appear and expose their scam. Everything was fine. The young man was tracking his real father's phone using geolocation, and now he should be in the hospital. While the girl was treating the teacher to fruits, Zhao Yu was frankly bored and did not know how to entertain himself. The detective remembered the trip the night before, wondering if the doctor had finished dissecting the body where she was. After the meeting ended, the guy went to the office of Group A to the police station. The forensic expert was discussing work issues with a police officer when they were interrupted by a young man who urgently demanded attention. The guy hugged the doctor around the waist. The officer wanted to help Wang Fei in her new case. He was very interested in this case. Zhao Yu asked the doctor ambiguously if the girl had any free time in the evening to discuss the details of the investigation. The young man was interrupted by Detective Xin, who informed him that he had a lot of things to do today and would not have time for this at all. The guy was told that he didn't have to worry about the investigation because Ku Ping and her team had already taken over the case. And he was given a new phone, and the old one could be thrown away because it would no longer be needed. The policewoman issued a training notice, according to the training plan of their department. Zhao Yu was a participant in the program. In the afternoon, the guy was ordered to take his things and go to the reception. At the appointed time, the detective arrived at the training location to begin his duties. The guy couldn't understand why the system had recently been issuing such strange items as binoculars, 3 indicators for determining the state of objects, a signal blocker, and an air quality detector. Sometimes, all the hero had to do was sneeze, and the theme would give him a new, sometimes not very clear trigram. The young man's thoughts were drawn out by the appearance of a girl whom everyone called Sister In. A young, fit, and serious-minded beauty walked through the gym to meet a boy. The guy almost lost his jaw from the beauty of the girl, as he was told. She was also a detective, and an incredibly beautiful one at that. The young man turned on all his magic to the maximum and went to meet the newly arrived young lady. Zhao Yu noticed that the lady had just arrived and had not seen the painful techniques that were shown to them and offered to help in teaching her. The beauty looked at the guy in surprise. She didn't expect such impudence from the newcomer. Others present in the hall thought that the hero had gone crazy because Sister Ying was a master of martial arts, a 2-time champion in elite sparring, and few were worthy opponents for her. Officer Zhao couldn't know that none of the attackers the girl had captured had any chance. They had all become disabled. The beauty became interested in how quickly her new opponent would appear, and she agreed to the young man's proposal. The detective suggested first teaching the seemingly completely innocent girl the joy of the elbow. The guy smiled and lured the young lady with his hand, commanding his rival to attack him. Sister Ying swung her fist forcefully towards the area where the smug young man's face was located. To the surprise of everyone present, Zhao Yu managed to stop the martial arts champion's strike. The hero grabbed the beauty by the hand, claiming that the combination he was showing was very simple, designed especially for beginners. The guy brought the policeman's end behind her back, showing her how to properly hold the opponent's hands when grabbing the elbow. The girl smiled. She began to like this training because few could be a worthy opponent for her. So this sparring became a breath of fresh air. Rapture was very simple for beauties, which is why she believed that she could easily get out of it. The detective found the champion's statement funny. He didn't really believe in such a possibility, and that's why he felt great. The very next second, Sister Ying's tightly clenched fist met the young man's face. It was a nasty blow to the guy's pride, and it also left a mark on his face. But that's not the end. What the guy saw next made him break out in a cold sweat. The policewoman delivered her second blow, but this time with a strong turn with her lower limbs. At the last second, Zhao Yu managed to block the girl's strike with his hand. The guy rode across the entire ring, stopping only thanks to the fence, which he crashed into with his back. The detective touched his bruised cheek with his hand. He hadn't taken such a strong blow in a long time. Finally, the young man understood why, except for him, no one in the hall dared to approach the girl. She only seemed like a weak flower on the outside, but in fact, she was a karateka. Everyone except the hero was afraid of the beauty. That's why they kept their distance, the boy concluded. The lady apologized to the guy with a smile. She hoped that he was not too angry that she had miscalculated her strength. As compensation, the girl offered to teach the detective how to use her neck. His face darkened. He also knew the techniques and how to get out of rapture, and he certainly wanted to demonstrate it. The beauty was confused. She did not understand what the young man was talking about. Sister Ying accepted the fighting barbell. If the young man was not afraid that she would break his arms, he could attack her. The young lady was not against it. Zhao Yu lunged forward, but the girl moved her body in time, leaning to the other side. The champion couldn't believe that her opponent was really going to punch the beauty in the face. The detective smiled. His diversion had worked exactly as planned. The guy grabbed the girl's hand firmly for the second time during the sparring, performing another technique. The young man pulled the upper limbs of the beauty behind her back, holding her in a position that was very inconvenient for a counterattack. Sister Ying realized that she wouldn't be able to break out of her rapture so easily this time, but she ordered the guy to let her go immediately. The detective lowered his lips very close to the girl's ears to create the illusion that only she could hear their conversation. The young man told the officer that her blow was too strong and now he could not move, which made everyone watching their sparring laugh. The young man, still not moving away from the beauty, asked to call him Brother Yu and said that he could teach the girl many different techniques if she wanted. The guy was still pressing too close because the athletes, which in turn began to irritate her, The girls swung their heads violently and landed them on Zhao Yua's face, causing him great pain and suffering. The guy grabbed his nose and it suffered the most, perhaps even broken or knocked out. The young man realized that he had lost his vigilance and it could cost him too much. The foot of the angry elite sparring champion, with great speed and incredible force, fell on the detective's head. The young man pulled himself together in time to grab the girl's lower limb at the last moment. The fight between the young men attracted more and more spectators. Passions grew heated, and sparks flew from the couple in different directions. Zhao Yu smiled mockingly. He said that the girl's leg is very good, but she does not have enough strength to knock the guy down. The girl was becoming increasingly irritated by the guy's behavior. She dreamed of erasing his vulgar smile from his face forever. The champion lifted her other leg off the mat, preparing for a counterattack. The karateka rose into the air, using her lower limbs to grab the guy's neck and force him onto his shoulder blades. The guy fell back onto the ring, under the weight of his opponent's body. The detective's eyes were blazing with anger. He didn't like this state of affairs. He didn't want to give up. The beauty looked at the young man with concentration, like a lioness at a hunted prey that could not escape. A new, diabolical idea of liberation from a disadvantageous situation shone in the young man's mind, which made him incredibly happy. Sister Ying jumped from the pain that pierced her body. The boy sank his teeth into the soft part of the young lady's body. The young men wanted to continue the carnage in the ring when they were interrupted by the voice of the trainer, who considered that such behavior in the ring was not at all sporting and unworthy of the police. The man was unhappy with such disgraceful behavior in his gym and ordered the guy and the girl to go to different corners of the ring. The champion ordered the young man not to show his face to her again, otherwise it could end badly for him. The detective was not at all frightened by the girl's empty threats. He wanted to tell the beauty the same thing. The young men who could not calm down were thrown out of the gym. He did not want to deal with them, but was going to entrust this task to their superiors. The system informed the young man that the meeting was complete. The completion rate was 51%, and he received a night vision device. The voice of the deputy head of the department was heard throughout the hospital building. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. It must have been a really bad joke. The deputy tried to convey to the older husband that the guy was still new and had been fooling around all day instead of working. The interlocutor was sure that the young man was persistent and his fighting spirit was stronger than any criminal. He could not be underestimated. Therefore, he was ideal for the role of successor. Looking out the window, he informed his deputy that he had already taken care of everything. But first, he needed to work a little more on the guy's character. The detective, looking bored, stood near the same house and gnawed on a lollipop. Zhao Yu and a junior police officer stood outside the building where the deceased lived. They were sent to look for evidence. Li Weini didn't understand why the elder didn't refuse the task because he had just returned from training and he had already been sent to investigate the case with the missing details. The case entrusted to the police officers was very old. It could not be solved for 10 years. The guy thought that it would be easy to deal with a long-standing investigation that had long since reached a dead end. Touching the door, the young man promised his assistant that as soon as they sorted everything out, he would treat her to something tasty. The guy entered the long-abandoned room and looked around. In front of the hero lay a lonely sofa, shabby, worn walls, and many empty bottles. 10 years ago at 8 o'clock in the evening, a severe thunderstorm was raging outside, and the victim, named Yu Jigen, was lying relaxed on his sofa. An unknown blurry figure in green appeared in an alley near the block where the murder took place. There were no surveillance cameras near the crime scene, so this was the only information the police had. 40 stabs resulted in the immediate death of the victim. This was all the evidence against the criminal. Instead of a face and name, no fingerprints or traces of the killer were found at the crime scene. Even the door handle was completely untouched, so either the victim opened the door himself or the criminal had a key. On the wall of the house, there was an inscription written in the blood of the victim, stating that everyone pays their debts. If the scoundrel was thirsty for revenge, he would not write the word debt. But if the murdered man was still guilty, then it was not necessary to stab the man 40 times. The criminal left a large pool of blood at the scene and a message that left behind more questions than answers. The detective could not understand what exactly the killer's goal was, why this particular man suffered. The guy was distracted from his heavy thoughts by a phone call. The young man looked at the screen of the new device in surprise. He did not expect such a turn of events. Yao Ji was calling him. The girl wanted to know if the guy was single. She wanted to treat the young man to lunch this afternoon. The restaurant where the young people met served delicious first courses, but the main courses were also excellent. The girl had long wanted to invite Zhao Yua to dinner, so that it would not be him who stole her bag. The accessory was very valuable to the beauty because her beloved boyfriend gave her the handbag. Even the thought of losing her bag made the girl incredibly sad. She really didn't want to lose it under any circumstances. The young man didn't understand what Yao Jie was getting at, but purely subjectively, he didn't like this conversation at all. Zhao Yu enjoyed the delicious food. If the girl had something to say, then she should say it directly, and he would help as much as he could. The young lady was very excited by the guy's proposal and asked the detective to check on her boyfriend. The completion rate this time was already 59%. The hero received an invisibility detector, the program reported. Yaozi was afraid that her lover might get into trouble because he was constantly borrowing money from her, the policeman said on the phone while sitting in his car. On the other end of the phone was Zhang Jingfeng, who said that the guy worth following was named Kang Jie, and when he had more detailed information, he would call back. From the car window, the detective saw a woman with a child. Lin Meifeng was the wife of the deceased Yu Jigen, and also one of the main suspects in the case of his death. She suffered from her husband's beatings for a long time, and once even had a miscarriage. The victim even once threatened his wife's entire family that he would break her father's leg. The woman had an ironclad alibi. On the night of her husband's death, she was in the hospital, where she was helping her cousin give birth. The next day, when Lin Meifeng found the body, she was very scared and her neighbors helped her call the police, after which the woman tried to lose herself many times and ended up in the hospital with depression. The lady had a hard time recovering from everything and had married the second man and was now happily spending her days with her little daughter. But the detective believed that there was still a chance that she could be the killer. The human search specialist called again and said that he had found the guy he had asked about. Yaozu's beloved produces defective goods in his factory and goes to the wholesale market today to sell them. Zhang Jingfeng sent the policeman his location. Zhao Yu arrived at the wholesale market and activated the GPRS system. The detective heard someone behind him shouting to stop. A tall man with long hair tried to catch up with and detain a woman. The policeman's new acquaintance from the gym ran after her husband and ordered him to stop. The young man stopped the unsuccessful criminal by putting his foot in front of him. The man with long hair landed face down on the asphalt, documents, folders, and various trinkets from his hands flying everywhere. The guy bent down to pick up the wallet that interested him. It wouldn't hurt to know who they had detained. A very angry policewoman pushed away a young man who was blocking her path to the criminal. The elite fighting champion pushed off the floor and landed on the runner's face. Zhang Yu thought that the girl was capricious because there was no other reason to beat him at all. A detective pushed away a colleague who was beating up a man with long hair. The dissatisfied young man decided to take revenge on the unsuccessful criminal in order to teach him good manners. Anger boiled in the karateka's blood as laughter pushed her this non-entity, and concurrently, a former sparring partner. The fight between police officers escalated with renewed vigor. The boy and the girl sent each other passionate, angry glances. No one wanted to back down. It was a fundamental dispute. The first to strike was Sister In. She jumped up and tried to kick the young man. But Zheng Yu also didn't want to retreat and surrender to the karateka. He still remembered their recent sparring. Everyone nearby came running to the brawl between the young people. The policemen were dragged to different corners, but the young man could not stop because he had helped catch the criminal and did not believe that he deserved such gratitude. Captain Miao also tried to hold back because she had already caught the criminal, but the girl insisted that the young man could be his accomplice. Two men pulled the thief away, believing that he was just a person who accidentally found himself in the epicenter of events. In the building of the wholesale market, the scandal between the policemen continued, both noting that it would be better not to be seen by their opponent, because they would definitely regret the meeting. Chao Yu looked at Kangji's coordinates and realized that he was just wasting his time because he had forgotten the main thing and the guy had moved away from him. The young man took out of his pocket the wallet he had picked up when he stopped the man with long hair, but the pain in his face prevented him from fully concentrating on the matter. The karateka had a very strong blow. The detective carefully examined the find. This result was better than nothing. The young man took a photograph of the thief out of his wallet. He could not understand what this man had done wrong. The guy looked at the photo carefully. He wanted to know why he was catching the owner of the wallet. Under the man's photo, the hero found an unexpected find, namely a photo of Lin Meifeng. But why the man had a photo of the suspect in his wallet is unclear. Already in the R department, the young man learned that the owner of the wallet was named Liu Penfei. He was 41 years old and was engaged in the wholesale of clothes. He had more than 1,000,000 yuan on his cards, and he also owned 3 houses and 2 cars. The guy asked what relation the man had to their suspect. Zhang Jingfeng replied that none, but he and the deceased were from the same city. The fair-haired guy was shocked that this was the same case that no one could solve for 10 years, and Zhao Yu just picked up the wallet and found the evidence. He was very lucky. The system reported that the meeting was successful. The completion rate was 80%, and the young man received an invisible listening device. The hero looked at the found photograph and realized that it was taken secretly. The officer decided to talk about it with the owner of the wallet. If he kept the photo of the girl, then perhaps he was secretly in love with her. The police officer said they took prints from the wallet and looked at the criminal history. In the database, he had already been investigated several times for minor offenses. This time, he had injured someone and the U department was dealing with him. The police needed to find out who the offender was, but he was currently being held in another station, so Li Weini asked if anyone knew anyone there. All eyes in the room turned to Zhao Yua. The young man understood without words what his colleagues were hinting at, but he didn't like this idea at all. The U-section building was not far away, so the young man got there quite quickly. The detective smiled sweetly at the local workers, although he did not want to be in the room right now. The elite fighting champion couldn't believe that the guy had the nerve to show up in front of her again to cause trouble. The young man came close to Captain Miao. According to her, it might seem that the young man was a maniac, but he came through business and not to clarify personal issues. The beauty refused the guy's request to interrogate Liu Penfei. She didn't have enough justification. The young man needs to bring all the official documents on the investigation, and then they can discuss his request. It would take at least a month to prepare the official papers, but Zhao Yua didn't have that much time and offered to help with something else. The detective was still clinging to Captain Miao and remembered how she had allowed herself to be bitten during their sparring last time. The young man wondered if the policewoman was still angry at his little joke. Miao Ying pushed the young man away and said that anyone could interrogate the suspect, but not a young man. The beauty showed the detective the exit and told him not to show up at her station again. The guy smiled. This was not the result he expected. Zhao Yu stood in the middle of the station, thinking about what other options he had to get to the suspect. The fight between the young men attracted outside observers who did not understand where this impudent fellow came from and how he dared to anger Captain Miao. The detective took a deep breath, closing his eyes, and the girl clearly didn't want to help in any way. Walking towards the exit, the brunette asked the girl if she believed that he could cut off the entire department from the world. The boy had superpowers and could make the entire building remain without means of communication, and the phones would remain without signal. The girl, who did not expect such a turn of events, froze, not understanding what was happening at all. A wave of laughter swept through the department. No one believed in the young man's superpowers. Everyone thought that he was either sick or had a very rich imagination. Miao Ying was amused by the situation and promised that if the guy could really leave the entire building without a signal, she would let him go to the criminal. The young people continued their battle of views. No one wanted to give in. The detective touched the girl's shoulder, hoping that she would keep her promise. The champion was upset by the young man's closeness, and he said it was time to read the spell. While the karateka ordered the employee to bring a signal detector, the young man launched an invisible blocker. The young man put his fingers to his temple and began to shout loudly that Captain Miao was a fool. The girl started to lose her temper. Did this guy really want to end his life like this? The captain heard that the signal in the building had disappeared, and this cooled her ardor a little. The police were concerned. The connection in the lower part of the house had completely disappeared. No one understood how this was possible. The karateka checked her phone. She also had no network, and the assistant reported that the detector could not find a signal. The beauty cast a suspicious glance at the guy. She couldn't believe that this was even possible. Zhao Yu smiled happily. Maybe now they would let him interrogate the detainee. In the interrogation room sat murder suspect Liu Pengfei. Unexpectedly for the criminal, the door opened with a loud bang, and a young man unknown to him appeared in the passage. The detective looked at the suspect, and finally he got the appointment he had been given. The guy felt a strong push in his back, causing him to lose his balance. Following the young man, Captain Miao entered the interrogation room, with the young man blocking her passage. The champion looked at the hero and couldn't understand how he managed to turn off the signal. There was something wrong with this impudent fellow. The system helped the young man again. The officers seemed to really believe in the guy's superpowers. It's good that he had an invisible signal jammer. This time, the detective decided to try out another device, namely an invisible lie detector. Zhao Yu ordered the criminal to answer his questions only yes or no, which greatly interested the karateka. The first question put the accused murderer into a slight stupor. The hero asked if the man was. The prisoner answered the question honestly, and a green button lit up on the system. The young man continued the interrogation with the next question. Was the long-haired man a woman? To which he answered honestly. The criminal also had no problem answering the next question, because his name was indeed Liu Pengfei. The young man then asked if his opponent liked pies. The interrogation continued. The criminal said that his parents were not divorced. Finally, Zhao Yu asked if it was really his coffee or if it was the prisoner who killed Yu Jigen. The man who lost his wallet's eyes widened in horror. Cold sweat ran down his face. He didn't expect such a question during a simple interrogation. The criminal's nerves couldn't take it anymore. His heart was jumping out of his chest. He screamed with all his might that it wasn't true. For the first time that day, the red button on the detector lit up. The detective didn't like this answer. He stood up, looked at the prisoner, and said loudly that everything he said was a lie. He grabbed the criminal by the lumps. He wanted to know if he knew the wife of the deceased Lin Maifeng. Captain Miao began to worry and ordered to release her husband. The girl did not understand why the guy became so nervous after asking several questions. Was the prisoner really guilty of the crime that happened 10 years ago? Little sister Ying looked at the young man and could not understand what exactly he knew. To at least slightly put his thoughts in order, the detective began to draw a turtle on a piece of paper. The guy found the same killer. He was now sitting opposite. Zhao Yu looked at the same criminal with anger, but now he still didn't have any evidence. The young man looked over his shoulder. He absolutely had to find a way to make Yu Jigen confess. Through the glass door, the detective saw Miao Ying talking with one of her colleagues in the corridor. A cunning plan blossomed in the guy's head on how to get the killer to talk. The hero approached the champion and asked for a few minutes of her time to discuss an urgent matter. The girl smiled surprisingly tenderly and agreed without any argument. The guy didn't understand why the captain suddenly started treating him so warmly. Miao Ying took out a photo from the archive of the inscription left at the crime scene in the FM area. The champion placed the photograph in front of the prisoner and asked why the handwriting on the wall matched his by 91%. The girl also added that the height of the dark figure caught on surveillance cameras that evening completely matched the criminal. Detectives believe the man did everything possible to avoid leaving any traces or fingerprints. The police managed to find the only piece of evidence that did not belong to the victim. It was the killer's hair, which completely matched the prisoner's DNA. The frightened criminal looked at the police officers. He did not expect that the 10-year-old case would come up during today's interrogation. Longhair was scared. It was impossible. The police had slandered him. The husband urgently needed to meet with his lawyer. The detective watched the scene before him with a blank expression. Miao Ying looked at the guy and with her eyes alone said that they wouldn't be able to get a confession like that and was thinking of leaving the suspect alone. The guy had completely different plans. It was time to pull out the last trump card from his sleeve. Zhao Yu pressed himself against the criminal in the shelter and showed him the photo. In addition to the material evidence, they had something else. The photo showed Lin Maifeng, and the young man said the girl had agreed to testify against the killer. The blood drained from Liu Penfei's face. He sat there as white as a wall. Could it be that the deceased's wife had told him everything? One thought came to the minds of both police officers at once. They did not understand what the prisoner was talking about. He decided to use a little trickery and asked if that was all the criminal had understood from their conversation. Recently, Captain Miao asked to get information about the guy and found out that he solved 2 crimes and even earned gratitude. But he was still assigned to investigate crimes from 10 years ago, apparently due to his explosive nature. 15 minutes earlier, a guy approached the champion and said that he was sure that their prisoner was a murderer and offered to put on a show for him. Zhao Yu suggested working on the evidence a little and making the criminal nervous, but he still needed him to confess to the murder on his own. Suddenly, Liu Pengfei spoke up and said that everything was correct. The officers were shocked. Their plan worked. The criminal confessed to the murder of Yu Jigen. The young men looked at each other. They were very proud of themselves. They managed to beat a confession out of the killer. The prisoner continued his story. He and the wife of the murdered man had entered into a contract to exchange murders. This information was not at all what the detectives expected to hear from a criminal's sincere confession. But the happy woman with the child that Zhao Yu was watching from the window of his car was also a ruthless killer. When Yu Jigen and the prisoner attended the same high school, at that time, the owner of the lost wallet was in love with a girl named Xiao Qin. The deceased managed to win the heart of the beauty and spread gossip about her, as if she was already with him. Very soon his lies spread like a forest fire throughout the entire village. The girl couldn't stand the constant conversations behind her back. Xiao Qin was forced to drop out of school and move to another city to find a job. Soon, rumors reached Liu Pengfei that his lover had started working as a whore, so he believed that the deceased definitely deserved to die. From everything she heard, the captain concluded that the killer asked Lin Maifeng to go to his house and spare the life of his own wife, Jian Wenli. Finally, the detective realized why Miao Ying suddenly changed her attitude towards him and started helping him. The woman needed help to get the prisoner to confess to another crime. The elite combat champion wanted to know why Liu Pengfei ordered the murder of his wife. The man wanted the woman he married dead from the very beginning. Jian Wenli never respected the prisoner and often cheated on him with other men. The job and the house where the family lived were all arranged by the murderer's father-in-law, and he himself was only a nanny, cleaning up after his wife. After some time, Liu Pengfei saw a film in which people entered into a contract to exchange murders. Then the long-haired man found Lin Maifeng, who had been beaten by her husband for a long time. So he knew for sure that deep down she hated him. Only in this way could the prisoner avenge Xiao Qin's fate, but also kill his wife. The woman rejected the offer and the matter had to be postponed, but hope still glimmered in the man's heart. As a result, Yu Jigen beat his wife almost to death, which caused her to have a miscarriage, and she herself came to the killer. The accomplices signed an agreement and even recorded everything on a dictaphone in order to have incriminating evidence against each other. On the day of his death, Jian Wen was arrested at the factory, and when Yu Jigen died, his wife was in the hospital helping a relative give birth, so they both had alibis. The prisoner had lived well for the last 10 years, and now, having confessed everything, he even felt relief. The detectives listened to this story about the murders and had nothing to add. The street food stand celebrated the closure of the FM Alley murder case. Colleagues congratulated the detective, because after 10 years, no one but him could find the killer. And even they could not believe that such scenarios happen not only in films. For them, the young man was like Sherlock Holmes from another universe. The system reported that the completion rate was 90%, and the boy received 3 invisible surveillance cameras. A few hours ago, the colleagues shook hands. Their cooperation turned out to be surprisingly pleasant. Miao Ying promised to report the details of the 2 cases to their superiors, and the young people would then cooperate in solving these cases. The couple exchanged phone numbers and promised to send each other all the details of the case. Zhao Yu's face darkened at the thought of having to issue an arrest warrant for Lin Maifeng. The karateka didn't understand the sudden change in the guy's mood. The girl looked at the detective and asked what was bothering him. The guy couldn't believe that the victim's wife was also the killer. The woman had gone through a lot after her husband's death. Captain Miao didn't want to jump to conclusions. First, the suspect had to come to the station. Then they would know all the details of the crime. Chao Yu couldn't forget his recent opponent. She turned out to be not only beautiful, but also very smart. The young man was remembering the girl's gentle hands and soft skin when his phone rang. There was a beauty's face on the mobile screen, and she was asking the guy to come urgently. It was already deep night, but some of the windows in the U Station building were still lit. The police were busy with urgent matters. The detective ran down the corridor as fast as he could after the call. He was in a great hurry to see the champion. He even called a taxi. The guy was flushed and breathing heavily. The girl even decided that he was not sober, and he wanted to quickly find out what happened and why the beauty called him. A police officer recently questioned Lin Maifeng, and she revealed that she did indeed use a knife to kill Jian Wenli, but the autopsy report showed that the woman died of suffocation. Zhao Yu didn't feel very well, but he forced the driver to drive as fast as possible, and that's why he was swaying. Miao Ying did not pay attention to the guy's condition and continued to tell that there were indeed stab wounds on the victim's body. But they were not very deep, and if the suspect found out about everything, she had no reason to lie. Perhaps the girl was killed by someone completely different, someone they have yet to learn about. Several shoe prints were found at the crime scene, but the woman said she put on shoe covers before entering the house. The guy was almost green as he listened to how, in order to make it look like a robbery, all the valuables in the west bedroom had been ransacked. But according to the crime scene report, the east bedroom had also been ransacked. The young man held back his nausea, but still came to the conclusion that there was a third person in the house on the day of Jian Wenli's murder. Captain Ying believed that perhaps the victim was strangled first, and then the suspect came and stabbed her again. Perhaps she mistakenly believed that she had killed her, but in fact, this was not the case. The girl finally noticed the detective's grave condition. His face was green. Zhang Yu couldn't help but pour out everything he had eaten and drunk over the past few days. Miao Ying Beulah is very angry that particles of the boy's stomach contents got on her clothes and shoes. Having placed the voice of a very angry girl throughout the building, she was unhappy that she had to change her clothes. In the interrogation room, the detective, with a buzzing in his head, asked to answer a few questions. The policeman asked Lin Meifeng to answer the questions asked either this way or not. The first question was whether the woman really killed the victim, to which she answered in the affirmative. The invisible lie detector lit up red, but why the woman would lie about it is unknown. The detective asked if the victim had been killed with a knife, and the prisoner also answered in the affirmative. But this was a lie. The young man didn't know whether she really believed what she was saying or was deliberately covering up for the real killer. The hero asked the new mother if she knew who killed Jian Wenli, which surprised her greatly. Zhao Yu noted that the answer could only be yes or no. Lin Meifeng answered yes to this question as well. But the system considered all of her answers to be lies. The detective was shocked. The prisoner really had no idea who the real killer was. The young man needed to know whether the woman had already been killed when she stabbed her. The wife of the man who died in the FM alley did not understand why the policeman was asking such strange questions and did not know the answer to the last question. The woman said that she was very scared and simply stabbed the blanket several times with a knife. No one moved. The detective said nothing, but simply looked at the accused in silence. Chao Yu smiled. The woman mistakenly believed that she had killed Lin Meifeng, but this meant that the real killer was still at large. The couple went to the roof of the house to discuss everything they had learned. Miao Ying believed that since the detainee had already confessed, it would be logical to close the case. The young man did not like this plan because they both heard that when the woman pierced the blanket, they did not even know whether the victim was alive at that moment or not. The detective decided to remind them that if they closed the case now, it would be much easier. They would receive medals, awards, but if they didn't, they would have to continue working from morning until night or catch the killer. The girl continued to say that 10 years had already passed, and if they reopened the case now and the victim's relatives found out about it, they would not calm down until they found out the truth and would put additional pressure on them. The champion expressed her opinion and wanted to hear from the young man what they should do next with the matter. He smiled. He already knew what to answer to this question. Chao Yu looked at his former rival carefully. If she wanted to close the case, then she wouldn't tell him all this now. Besides, if it was as Miao Ying said, she wouldn't have called the hero at such a late hour. The police captain was embarrassed. The guy caught her. The girl decided not to lose face completely and said that she already regretted her decision to call the guy because he poured the contents of his stomach on her. The guy hoped that the karateka would not hold a grudge and that together they would catch the real killer. In the morning, the murderer from the District FM was transferred to Detachment A. Department U is now looking for the one who killed his wife and asked to keep him in another place for now to sort out the case. Through the window, the detectives saw a large crowd of people running somewhere. Li Weini told the elder that in the case of the body in the Q reservoir, the suspect was an athlete tracer, and the last time the police grabbed him, they only managed to put on half of the handcuffs. Now, the police have received a report that a man with handcuffs on his hands was seen at the Q reservoir 2 days ago, whose description matched Yang Wentao, and everyone went to catch him. The detective wondered why the suspect might have returned to the scene of the crime. The Cunning Loach reported that there were a lot of villages near the reservoir, and it would take a lot of time to find the fugitive in such an area. So the young man decided to leave too, but he was told that the head of the department was calling him. Zhao Yua needed to catch the criminal. He was thinking only about the investigation and promotion of even the guy who was of little interest to him. For 3 days, the guy was driving to the Q reservoir and thought that recently the system only gives him navigation, which strengthens the signal similar to she is afraid that the hero might get lost. Li Weini, who was in the car with the elder, was very surprised why they were going east when the villagers reported seeing Yang Wentao heading west. The young man believed that what the criminals saw did not give a clear picture. Perhaps then he was heading from the western part to the eastern one. The police have already searched everything north and south of the reservoir and have had no results. The girl the car was passing by seemed very familiar to the detective. He had seen her before. The young lady looked like someone from Miao Ying's circle, whom the young man saw when he was in Department U last time. Zhao Yu didn't understand what the girl could have forgotten in this area. The young lady had already thanked Officer Liu, and after saying goodbye to him, was heading towards the parked car. A young man materialized in front of the redhead. He was very interested in who she was talking to. The unexpected encounter scared the girl almost to death. She screamed in horror all over the street, squeezing her beloved hand as tightly as possible. The young man was very angry, but still said that he had met with a detective who had once handled Jian Wenli's case, but was now retired and lived in that area. The detective remembered that Captain Miao had indeed promised to send people to talk to the officers who had once handled their case, but he had been very busy recently, so he had even gotten the chance to contact her. Zhao Yu decided to ask the policeman how the investigation was going, since that was how he got the information that the karateka had promised to send him anyway. If the girl decides to remain silent, the young man will simply take away her pen voice recorder, which was used to record the entire conversation. The captain of the red-haired team said that there was no need to share information with the young man because they had agreed to carry out the case together, but he had rushed off to look for the criminal at the reservoir and was very busy. The young man's plan failed when the girl snatched her property from him. The young lady said that she had the right not to disclose the information she received, which she intended to adhere to. Zhao Yu was at a loss. He didn't understand why he had to hide the details when he was currently handling both areas. Already getting into the car, the redhead added that the young man could contact their captain with any questions. The guy didn't let them open the car door. He wasn't planning on giving up so easily. The guy pressed the young lady against the door when he wanted something from him. No one had the right to refuse. The couple's fight was interrupted by an assistant, which greatly surprised the young people, who forgot that they were in a crowded place. While the junior police officer was asking why they had stopped, the redhead had already gotten into her car. The car drove away, leaving the police to watch as the driver weaved along the road. While the young men were distracted by the assistant, the guy pulled a pen voice recorder out of the pocket of the U-branch employee. The young man smiled. The redhead was still too young to play such toys with him. Zhao Yu was driving the car and listening to the stolen recording. He learned that the killer was at least 1 meter 88 centimeters tall and also limped on his right leg. The police also learned from the recording that small pieces of dirt were found on Jian Wenli's body, and that the killer most likely pinned her to the wall before strangling her. The idle in the car was interrupted by the young man's phone ringing. A very angry Miao Ying called and demanded that her colleague's stolen property be returned. Li Weini was very worried, although the detective tried to appear casual. Zhao Yu, with the most innocent voice, tried to assure Section Captain Yu that there was nothing to talk about and that he was not involved in the incident at all. The champion was in no mood for jokes. She said that Lin Maifeng's stationery store had been destroyed, and someone had also set fire to Liu Pengfei's storeroom. The beauty demanded that the detective return because the victim's relatives were seething. They demanded that the real criminal be caught as soon as possible. The guy promised to return as soon as he finished all the business, but for now he had materials. The police stopped at a gas station to replenish their fuel and food supplies. The officer returned the recorder to his red-haired colleague, and she warned him to be careful, as there were many cliffs around. The young lady, already leaving, shouted to the young man to watch his movements carefully, since he was not familiar with the area. She really did not want him to fall off the cliff and everyone to have to look for his body. The guy calmly ate ice cream, listening to his colleague's tirade and looking at the car driving away. A terrible thought came over the detective as he replayed in his mind over and over the girl's words about him not being familiar with the area. The hero ordered Li Wayne to check what their suspect was doing as soon as possible. The assistant found information that Yang Wentao was a clerk in the Technology Bureau, to which the detective noted that the accused might have been involved in site survey projects and might have visited there repeatedly. Zhao Yu knew that the criminal was familiar with this area, which was why he was hiding near the reservoir. The young man asked his assistant whether the suspect had taken any part in large-scale scientific research projects related to Reservoir Q. The girl found information that the killer was connected with a reformation project in an old silver mine near the village of Wei. He had been involved in the project for 3 years and was a frequent visitor there. The assistant was surprised by the elder's intuition, because the village Y was not far from their location. The detective was very pleased with himself and suggested that they quickly set out to find the criminal. The young people stayed overnight at a hotel, and since there were almost no free rooms, they had to occupy one shared room. Lee Waney asked the chief if he was going to go to bed, since it was already deep night outside. But the young man was too focused on the map of the area. Zhang Yu left the room so as not to disturb his colleague's rest. The guy thought that the criminal was searching for silver and knew about caves in the mines where he could hide while eating a delicious dinner. There were too many old mines in the area near them, and searching them could take several decades. The young man heard a loud barking somewhere at his own feet. A hungry dog looked at the guy very pitifully. The detective realized that the dog would really like to enjoy her incredibly tasty and aromatic dinner. With no other choice, the hero went to a convenience store near the motel to buy another batch of chicken drumsticks for his new friend. The red dog happily rushed at the treat. The head of the youth came to the conclusion that Yan Wentao needed something to eat in the mine, and perhaps he hid only at night and went to the city for food during the day. The boy took a photograph of the suspect out of his pocket and showed it to the dog. If the dog had been a service dog, it would have certainly helped find the killer. The well-fed dog happily opened its whole eye, looking at the photograph. Zhao Yu laughed at himself for such reckless behavior. Suddenly, the new friend ran towards the forest, calling the confused policeman to follow him. The detective ran through the dark thickets after the dog. He didn't even expect that he would be able to find the criminal. When the dog reached its target, it stopped to wait for its new friend. The young man was very tired from running after the escaped animal. He was breathing heavily, and sweat was streaming down his face and body. The treasure that the dog led the guy to completely threw the latter off balance. The disappointed detective was faced with animal excrement. From somewhere to the side, the ringing of metal in the middle of a quiet forest was like a bolt from the blue for the hero. Zhao Yu shone his phone's light at the place where the sound was coming from, and saw a man running quickly. Metal handcuffs could easily be seen on the fugitive's wrist. The detective remembered Lee Waney's words that the suspect was an athlete tracer, and the last time they tried to grab him, they only managed to put on half of the handcuffs because he escaped. The young man smiled. This time, the criminal would not be able to escape justice so easily. Young Wentao hid within the walls of a familiar cave and took out a knife from his pocket. He saw that the pursuer was approaching. The forest became too quiet, and the killer looked out from his hiding place to check where the guy had gone. The detective just waited for the criminal to lose his vigilance a little, and with one kick knocked him to the ground. Zhao Yu couldn't allow the former clerk to outwit him and hide again for an indefinite period of time. The criminal tried to reach for the weapon he dropped during the fall. The young man noticed young Wentao's intentions in time and grabbed his nostrils with 2 fingers. The killer flew several meters, hitting his back hard against the rocky walls of the cave. The detective grabbed his head. The whole world began to spin around him, and the ground beneath his feet was floating. He couldn't get tired so quickly. At the entrance to the cave, the young man's new friend scolded him, but he was in no hurry to go further, deeper. The system was flashing red. It informed that it was necessary to urgently leave the area due to lack of oxygen. Zhao Yu fastened the criminal's second handcuff to his own hand. The guy dragged the barely alive prisoner to the exit. They urgently needed to leave the walls of the cave. Something new caught the young man's attention. Hidden among the rocks was a medium-sized black bag. When all 3 reached an area with acceptable oxygen levels, the detective realized that there was no signal on the phone and he urgently needed to come up with a plan to get out. It's a good thing Zhao Yu had an invisible GPS with a signal booster in his pocket. The detective sent Peng Xin his location coordinates and heard that help had already left and would arrive in about 2 hours. He relaxed a little. The guy's attention was drawn to the find. He still had plenty of time to check it out. The bag looked very large, so the young man became interested in what could be inside. The container was filled to the brim with thick wads of banknotes. There were at least 100,000 in the bag, and in very old banknotes too, and the hero thought that their price should now be at least twice as much. He looked back at the cave. He didn't know where such a huge pile of money could have come from in an old abandoned mine. Zhao Yu held a photograph in his hands, which depicted him and the captured criminal. The police officers who arrived to detain the fugitive were surprised how the guy managed to grab him, because local residents saw the killer driving in a westerly direction, and they were now to the east of the reservoir. The detective, still holding the bag, told his colleagues that Lee Waney was still in the hotel in room 211 and asked them to pick her up on the way as he was tired and was going to take them home. The guy's new 4-legged friend sat by the car and looked trustingly into its eyes. The hero exhaled heavily, opening the door of his car so that the dog could take his place. The young man and his dog rode home through the rocky terrain of the canyon. The friends were climbing the stairs when the system announced that an invisible X-ray machine had been received for 10 minutes of use. Today, the program actually saved the life of a young man and helped him get out of a difficult situation. The first to climb up the stairs was a red dog, and he began to sniff a woman's shoe that shouldn't be there. The girl, with signs of beating and unconscious, sat in the middle of the corridor, leaning against the wall. Zhao Yue's shock was genuine. The young man had no idea what was going on. The stranger began to come to her senses when she smelled a strong, unpleasant smell. The first thing the girl saw with her still unclear vision was a large, furry nose sniffing her. The young lady screamed in fear, trying to move away from the unfamiliar dog. Opening the door to the apartment, the detective asked why the girl was sleeping in the entryway at such a late hour. The young lady forgot her keys to the apartment inside and simply decided to sit by the door until her roommate arrived, and then accidentally fell asleep. Chao Yu once again cast a searching glance at the girl. There were wounds on her face, possibly from a beating. The young man opened the door of his own apartment and invited his neighbor on the stairs to come inside and rest a little. Water sprayed out of the shower head in a strong stream. A new acquaintance asked the detective what his dog's name was, while the cute fluffy thing was in the bathtub. Without looking up from eating a banana, the guy said that the dog's name was Line Specialist. Because of the flow of water, the girl did not hear and decided that the young man said, "A wonderful specialist." The detective used a hairdryer to dry the rough hair of his now clean new friend. After bathing, the dog turned out to be, surprisingly, very beautiful. A large dog with long legs and thick fur. The neighbor told the guy that his pet was a Belgian shepherd, or simply Malinois, which the police often used as search animals. The girl's family bred different breeds of dogs at home, so she knew them very well. While a casual acquaintance was getting herself a snack, the boy asked her if she knew how old the four-legged creature was. The girl looked again carefully at her red-haired friend, who looked to be about 2 or 3 years old. There was a knock on the detective's door and the neighbor rushed to open it because she was sure it was for her. Behind the door, the girl's roommate was worried. She didn't understand why and simply didn't wait for her on the stairs, because if she hadn't heard the voice, she would hardly have decided to look in. To the detective's surprise, the neighbor turned out to be an old acquaintance of his, whom he had once saved from the rapist Posok Taser. The beauty realized that her partner was wet from head to toe and had completely misinterpreted the situation. The girl tried to explain that she was just helping the guy with his dog, so she was a little desperate and there was nothing between them. But it was too late. The young man didn't want things to turn out this way. His intentions were as good as possible. The next day, the police officer invited his assistant to Hogo's restaurant, where she complained that she had not yet finished her report on the FM area killer, and the senior officer had already caught the suspect at Q Reservoir. Li Weini already had calluses on her fingers, and she couldn't keep up with the speed of catching the young criminals. And now, a new worker had been taken into Team B, and Captain Ku Ping had asked for help getting his bearings. The second team solved a robbery case in a nursing home. The culprit was a security guard. He saw the director collecting donations and storing them in his office, and then changed the angle of the surveillance cameras and hid the money in the basement. The police were confused by the fact that there were no records of the robbery, and the captain immediately realized that it was one of their own. And when they began interrogating one of the guards, they found a new stack of keys, among which was a copy of the director's office, the control room, and the basement. While the detectives were talking, a fight was raging behind them. The restaurant director was being asked to sell the business, but he did not want to part with the family establishment and asked the robbers not to come again. One of the extortionists tried to throw the visitor out of the restaurant, but he was not going to leave until he finished eating. Glass from the broken beer can flew in different directions. The bandits really didn't like the rebellious visitor because he overheard their conversation with the director. The criminal was losing his temper. The veins on his forehead began to pulsate violently, and he wanted to quickly finish off the man who liked to poke his nose into other people's business. The man in the expensive suit's eyes widened as he realized that this was not at all how he expected to spend his lunch break. At the same time, the bureau chief reported that the head of the main department, Su Yan, would soon arrive at Branch R, so it was necessary to complete the distribution of positions for the next few months as soon as possible and fully support him. Su Yan really wanted to see the detective, but he and Li Weini had left. The policeman gossiped in the yard about the head of the department. Everyone was interested in what exactly he would do, but no one even knew what he really looked like. But there were rumors that he was a tall and red-faced man. At that time in the restaurant, the visitor's lunch flew past his red face. Very hot cutlets hit one of the bandits in the face, causing him to be badly burned. When the criminal turned around, he saw an angry Zhao Yua behind him. The young man looked closely at the main secret agent and told him that if he came to eat, then he should do so. But if for something else, then it was time for him to get out of the restaurant. The guy offered the robbers another option. They could attend their dinner in a police station cell. The young man's words greatly disturbed the men. They realized that he was an officer, which meant it was time to get out of the establishment. Returning to his seat, the young man complained to the assistant that he was not allowed to finish his meal in peace. But at that time, she was talking on the phone and promising someone that the couple was already leaving. Xiao Yu complained that he would not be allowed to finish his meal since they were urgently called to the department where the new head of the Supervision Bureau would soon be introduced. At Section R, the chief thanked Chief Su Yun for his wonderful speech and for coming to see them. The head of the site promised to fully support the man and help him in the future if he needed any help or just advice. The red-faced woman had heard rumors that there were some people named Zhao Yu working in the police force, and that he had already solved several cases in a row and was almost a legend in certain circles. The young man, while greeting the new leader, spoke on the phone to him, urgently needed to check who made a copy of the keys to the house of the victim, Jian Wenli. The guy didn't understand why everyone around him started looking at him very strangely, because he wasn't doing anything interesting. He was just doing his own thing. A recent acquaintance of his from the restaurant came up to the guy to say hello and said that they would now work together since he had recently been transferred. The detective shook hands with the head of the main directorate. It was a very pleasant second acquaintance. All the police officers were shocked that the men knew each other, and Su Yun promised to treat the young man to dinner because thanks to him, his face remained unharmed. The guy was walking up the stairs to his apartment after work and heard a group of young men trying to break into Hua Hua's apartment. These were the same guys who had beaten up his neighbor a few days ago, because they thought the girl should be grateful that their friend Hong liked her. The young man really didn't like this group because how dare these impudent people come to a woman and break down her door after everything they did? Zhao Yu's fists tingled from the sight he saw. The robbers also saw the young man who was watching them very closely. The guy introduced himself as Tianlu and asked which of the men was the leader of the pack, because he really wanted to get to know him. Great brother Hong from District C came forward. The gang was curious about where their new acquaintance came from. No one had heard of him before. The boy heard that District C had the best goods and that even brother Hong couldn't afford them. But the bandits contradicted him because all the best goods belonged to their boss. The guy resorted to all these tricks in order to record the robber's confession on a dictaphone. The detective chuckled. He had heard everything that was needed for the recording and the police. The guy, known to those present as Tianlu, asked if his name would become famous in the area if he punched the main bandit in the face, flexing his fists. The roommates stood behind the door and tried to hear what was happening in the corridor, but only some strange sounds of blows could be heard. The sounds died down a bit, and the beauties decided to look out the door to find out if the robbers had left. The detective had already sent the recording that the department had made, and the police were due to arrive soon to pick up the bandits who were scattered throughout the corridor. Talk of drug dealing and violence against women is enough to put men behind bars for a long time. The ladies were very grateful to Zhao Yua for saving them. It was unknown what would have happened if the guy had not arrived to help in time. The young man said that his services were not free at all and that they would have to be paid for very soon. The guy told the girls that they would now go to their room and wash themselves very well and tidy themselves up. The ladies were frightened by the guy's words because he said that they would have to work very hard for his help, and they didn't know how it could all end. The guy was lying on the bed, enjoying a massage from the girls he had saved, when Miao Ying entered the apartment. The guy was seriously scared when he saw the police captain at his home. He didn't understand why she came and what exactly she wanted. The champion was very angry. From the picture that was now opening before her eyes, the young lady did not understand how one could be so shameless. The girl explained that she was going to the department to say hello to the guy's new boss, and she needed him to go with her and help with the lawsuit in the Jian Wenli case. The woman noticed that the detective was a little busy and probably couldn't leave with her. The embarrassed young man said that he was completely free, and in a minute he would change his clothes and be ready to accompany his colleague. The young people were walking down a rather high staircase from the guy's apartment. The hero cast the most imperceptible glance at his former rival in order to understand his partner's mood. The young man believed that Captain Ying became more beautiful with each meeting. The young man's cheeks turned red, his thoughts became more and more frank. The guy dreamed of being able to use his X-ray machine on his police officer friend. The woman noticed her colleague's frank look, which did not please her very much, because the young lady was still hiding behind the compromising situation in which she found the guy. As he got into the car, the detective decided to change the subject and asked what would happen to Lin Maifeng when they found the real killer. Captain Ying replied that they would see what kind of verdict the court gave the woman, since she still had malicious intent. The defendant's husband said that if he hired the best lawyer to get her out, the result would most likely be good. There were conversations in the restaurant among people who believed that the killer's name was Aijun and that he limped on his right leg, and that he was from the same village of Jian Wenli, and that his brother worked in a clothing factory and knew that the family was very rich. While the guy was trying to slip some vitamins into the girl's plate, there was a conversation behind their backs about how one of the killers recognized Liu Pingfei's husband when he came to make keys to the house and made a duplicate. The brothers only wanted to rob the house. The offended champion threw the waste from her plate onto the astonished guy's plate. One of the police officers asked Zhao Yua how he knew that the man who dealt in key copies was involved. The guy said that earlier during interrogation, Lin Maifeng said that the door of Jian Wenli's house was closed, and then it was unclear how the killer was able to get inside. While searching for evidence, the detective found no traces of a break-in, which meant that the killer had keys to the house. And from this, the question arose of where he could have gotten them, so suspicion fell on the person who made the duplicates. Captain Miao praised Officer Zhou's sharp mind and said that their department was in dire need of detectives like him. The young man smiled at his partner's open flattery. He enjoyed compliments, even if they were not very sincere. The young lady also said that she had recently been at the young man's house and had met two of his girlfriends, one of whom was massaging his back and the other his leg. But the guy was still unhappy. The hero couldn't understand whether the karateka was praising him or just openly mocking him. The young man decided to maintain a playful tone of conversation and said that Captain Miao was a master of martial arts, and during sparring she beat the guy so badly that there was nothing left to do but bite him to get out of her delight. The young man's monologue drove his partner crazy. Miao Ying kicked the detective out of the room and ordered him to never show up in her sight again. The young man took out his phone. He didn't understand the girl because she started it first and for some reason took offense at a simple joke. In the area where the police took out the cafe, it was impossible to even call a taxi, so the guy had to walk a very long way. Chao Yu couldn't understand what exactly the beauty meant, whether the guy had really hurt her so much that the karateka didn't want to see him anymore. The young man saw a couple of celebrating young men near the store who captured his attention. The hero's smile became very wide. He just needed helpers in his new business and they came across the young man's path at the right time. The detective distracted the guys from their conversation, which didn't make them very happy. The young man pointed to a car parked nearby and said that its owner often humiliated the guy, so he asked his friends for a favor, so that they would pour their fountains on the car to teach the girl a lesson. The young man offered to pay $500 in cash for his services. The young men thought the guy was a bit of a pushover, but when it came to money, principles took a back seat. One of the partners went towards Captain In's car. He just wanted to relieve himself. The guy looked around to make sure no one would see him in a co-profilist position. Yellow liquid poured onto the car's wheels. The two-time elite fighting champion saw someone hanging around her car from her window, which she didn't like at all. To console the detective, the girl forced the robbers to wash her car until it shined, if the robber did not want bad consequences for himself. In the neighboring building, they heard screams from their friend Gao and decided to see what was happening on the street. The young man decided to take a closer look at the house from which people ran out. The room looked very strange. A large number of boxes with old editions of books and various artifacts were visible. The guy couldn't believe that these people were smugglers. The detective no longer had time to examine the building, because a large crowd of people was heading towards the police station. It seemed like the guy had overdone it this time. The hero made his way through a crowd of angry men who wanted to get even with the girl, to help her cope with the situation that he himself created. Miao Ying didn't seem to need any help. She scattered the attackers in all directions, not giving them a yellow chance. An unknown man raised a stool over the head of a beauty whom she did not notice. The wooden legs of a chair flew past the karateka's face. The policewoman turned around and saw Zhao Yu fend off the attacker from her. She didn't expect such actions from the young man. The young lady was shocked. She did not understand why the detective was helping her get out of this mess. The karateka fought off the attackers using all her martial arts skills. Many of the criminals already regretted that they had gotten involved with the police captain, because they understood that she was a delicate flower. The young lady dodged the fists that were flying mercilessly at her from all sides. The young people worked in pairs, covering each other's backs. Unexpectedly for the detective, Captain Ying hit him in the face with his elbow. The elite fighting champion with the most newsworthy appearance apologized to the young man and said that she simply did not see him. Zhao Yu couldn't understand why he got hit in the face by his former opponent again. He tried to come to the rescue, but the girl didn't like it either. The young man held his broken nose, and the name Miao Ying was ringing loudly in his head. Pushing away the attacker now, his target was only the beauty, who damaged the young man not only his face but also him. The young man threw the bandits in different directions, as if they were not living people but some kind of soft toys, but they weighed almost nothing. All the girl's senses were working at maximum when suddenly someone grabbed her by the shoulder from behind. Zhao Yu pulled the beauty towards him and, squeezing her in a tight embrace, pressed his lips hotly to hers. The captain's eyes widened. She didn't expect that her once strongest sparring opponent would kiss her tenderly. The girl did not understand what was happening, why the detective did this in the middle of a fight. The policewoman's face tensed. Now was not the time or place for passions. The lady pushed the young man away from her with all her might, and she was not pleased with the detective's actions. The guy was preoccupied with the champion's actions. His whole body was gripped by deep sadness and sorrow. Their colleagues were already running to help the couple, not knowing what was happening, who all these people around were, and why Zhao Yu kissed Captain Miao. The hero gave the order in a voice that was not his own to arrest the attackers, as they were engaged in smuggling. The girl watched the detective as he showed the arriving police officers where the criminals buried all the stolen goods. The beauty clenched her lower lip tightly between her teeth. She didn't want things to turn out this way. The young man was probably inadequate if he decided to do such an act right in the middle of the street. Once at home, Zhao Yu gave vent to his emotions and he hit the walls with all his might. The guy carefully looked at his reflection in the mirror. He was just an idiot if he thought that Miao Ying would just give him a kiss. The detective reproached himself for his actions, because everything could have turned out much worse for both of them. The beauty could have suffered because of the guy's recklessness, because they were in the midst of a fight. Zhao Yu was no longer a former street gangster, and now he had to think about what he was doing because all his actions had consequences. As soon as he got out of the shower, the young man saw a message on his phone from his neighbor Yang Hong. The girl wrote that she and her friend were afraid of revenge from Boss Hong's textbook, but the young man still did not expect to find them in their own bed with all their things moved. The neighbors thought that it would be better for them to stay in the detective's apartment for a while, for their own safety. Now the young lady was sleeping peacefully in the guy's bed, and obviously, this was not the first dream she had had. The guy couldn't believe that the two girls just decided to break into his apartment and stay there. The young man faced a serious question, namely, where to go to sleep, because the bed was already occupied. The boy was very tired after this hard day, and he really wanted to sleep in his comfortable, soft bed. So he simply landed between the young ladies, partially crushing them with his own body. It was a deep, dark night outside. Everyone was asleep except for a man in one of the rooms of an apartment building. Right in the middle of the night, the neighbors threw the young man out of bed, not allowing him to get a good rest. The detective brought a large black bag he had found in the caves to Department R. The young man heard that there was a good specialist working for the police who could tell the price of old bills in a bag if they had a serial number. The police were shocked. The bag contained at least 200,000 and very rare bills, each of which was worth at least 5 times its face value. The guy was already indulging in sweet dreams. There was so much money. Apparently, the system wanted him to get rich. The specialist examined the bag and saw something that made a cold sweat appear on his temples. Asked where the hero found this item, Zhao Yu emerged from his thoughts. He didn't understand why the policeman reacted so strangely to his discovery. This bag had already appeared in one case under the code name M. The money was collected by the parents of the kidnapped children and given to the criminals, the police officer told the young man. The guy couldn't believe that the detective was somehow connected to the kidnappers. Zhao Yu smiled slyly at everyone around him. One could only guess whether he really was a thief. Li Weini said that 25 years ago, there were several wealthy families living in M Village, and because the conditions for their children to study were the best, they sent them to a temporary school in the city. They were driven to school by a specially hired driver named Niu Weiguang, and they really enjoyed listening to music on the way. On that fateful day, the radio broke down and the man suggested that his pets sing a song about their childhood to have some fun on the road. As the red car entered the tunnel, cheerful children's voices could be heard coming from it. The children continued to sing, and the car sank deeper and deeper into darkness. At midnight, an incredible number of police officers, cars, and a helicopter had gathered in the rain at the mine where the bag was found, all on alert. The officers were ordered to search everything around for any evidence. 3 days after the car disappeared, the hijackers contacted the family and demanded a ransom of $1,200,000. The assistant finished her story. Unfortunately, this did not help the children return, because after the parents handed over the money, the kidnappers stopped communicating. And for all these 26 years, the police have not found any leads to this day. The bag with the money had an orange broom attached to it, just like the one on the bag the young man had picked up. Chang Jingfeng couldn't understand how the guy was able to catch the criminal and find a reason for another case. Perhaps the young man had some kind of superpower? This was the system's trick again, and the guy immediately found it strange because where could such a huge amount of money have appeared in such an abandoned place? The two officers were talking to each other. They couldn't understand what they could be doing in the middle of the night in such a place. They thought they were just wasting their time. All the searchers froze in place, listening to every sound. The police found something. Reporters besieged the police with questions, asking if it was true that they had managed to find the bodies of children kidnapped 26 years ago, whether all the victims had been found, and whether the mayor had arrived at the station. A police spokesman was unable to provide any comments at this time and promised that as soon as news emerges, journalists will be informed. The young man was in a very gloomy mood. No one could have imagined that such a find awaited them in the mine tunnels. For all these 26 years, the bodies of the stolen children lay in that mine. So this could only mean one thing. The investigation into the kidnapped children in District M has officially been reopened. Zhao Yu entered the conference room when the police official had already started his report on the case. There were a lot of people in the room. The young man was lucky that the assistant saved a seat for him. 5 bodies were found in an abandoned mine, and DNA tests identified the 4 children: Liang Meili, age 9, Liang Zhuheng, age 12, Tao Zhao, aged 11, and Liu Hongxiang, age 10. The last body belonged to a driver named Niu Weiguang, who had accompanied the children to school that day and fled with them. At 12 o'clock at night, the police station was almost frolicking. Only the lonely figure of a young man could be seen in the corridors. The boy looked out the window at the full moon and remembered meeting the parents of the kidnapped 11-year-old Tao Zhao a few hours earlier. The police officer introduced Zhao Yu to the parents of one of the dead children, since it was he who found the crime scene and the bag with the ransom money. The dead boy's father shook the detective's hand firmly. He was very grateful to the officer for some even disappointing news about his son. The woman was crying loudly and shaking violently the whole time, so the man spoke first. After all these years, they were very tired of the unknown, but the young man gave them a chance to say goodbye to their son. The husband could no longer hold back his tears. Emotions completely overwhelmed him, but the detective promised to find the killer, no matter what. The only one of the kidnappers' victims who still has not been found was little Cece. If the girl had not died that night, she would now be about 33 years old, and perhaps it would be possible to find her based on the image drawn by the experts. The young man was deeply immersed in his thoughts and didn't even notice that, besides him, someone else was working at the police station until late at night. The guy wondered which of his colleagues was so dedicated to the cause that he still hadn't gone home. In the office, the detective saw Ku Ping. She always took the investigation very seriously, and it is not surprising that she was the one working late, because the girl never lost hope. The girl looked over her shoulder and saw Zhao Yua. She couldn't understand why the guy was still at the police station. The detective smiled, even a little amused by his colleague's behavior, and replied that he had come to learn from his superior. The head of the B department admitted that she might not like the guy, but his talents were extremely valuable, especially in the last days in their very difficult case. The policewoman was completely open to cooperation and wanted to hear if the hero had any thoughts about their case. The young man looked at the beauty and thought over all the options. This evening could turn out to be much more interesting than he expected. The officer's mood improved significantly. He took the pen from his colleague and decided not to be offended by the barbs, but to take all her words exclusively as compliments. Tonight was not a night for fun, as the police had too much work to do. The young man shared his opinion that for so many years the police could not find a single clue because they believed that the kidnappers had prepared a perfect plan in advance. The guy had a completely different idea. He completely disagreed with the previous detectives who investigated this case. According to Zhao Yua, their abduction could indeed have been just an accident. Ku Ping was very surprised. She didn't understand where the detective's theory was leading and how it could even be. His theory sounded too incredible. The hero began to explain that usually after a hijacking, the criminals immediately contact the victims' families and demand a ransom from them. The purpose of the early call was to prevent the parents from contacting the police, but this time the call was made only 3 days after the disappearance, and this was a very strange decision. It was also unusual that this time the car disappeared with the children, because usually criminals take their victims away in their own cars. Minivans are much more noticeable to people, and besides, if the police had stopped them, many questions would have arisen. Given the information that has been collected over the years, there were at least 3 killers. There were already 5 children on the way to school, plus 1 adult driver, and if you add 3 more people to them, it's unlikely that everyone would be able to easily fit in a not very large car. The guy shared his own, very unusual version of the events of that terrible day. It was a very fresh thought that did not occur to any of the detectives working on the case. The head of the department was interested in her colleagues' opinions. He spoke very confidently and convincingly. There were facts that did not fit into the theory because if the kidnappers were not professionals, then how did they even think of calling and demanding a ransom, killing the hostages, and escaping? Everything was done simply perfectly. The guy smiled. Of course, the girl had never kidnapped anyone, so she couldn't know anything about it because such a thing requires high skill. The guy knew a lot of criminals, and none of them could have pulled off such a perfect crime. He believed that at first, they didn't have any plan because they just wanted to steal a car or money and didn't expect that there would be so many people in the car. Ku Ping couldn't believe what she heard because what could the guy mean when he said that she hadn't kidnapped anyone? Was he really hinting that he had once had a similar experience? The young man cleared his throat and wanted to change the subject as quickly as possible. How could the young lady even think about such a thing? After all, when investigating such cases, they have to look at all the eyes of the criminals. The girl agreed. Of course, the guy looked like the kind of person who would use such methods of work. The detective also denied the version that the driver Niu Weigong was in cahoots with the killers, because he was from the same village with the children and enjoyed his work, so there was no point for him to take part in the kidnapping. Moreover, Zhao Yu was certain that if the kidnappers were still alive, they would be incredibly rich people. The poor people wouldn't just leave a bag with 200,000 in cash in the middle of a mine that no one else knew about. They would just take it with them right away. The police finally had a lead. They had to check everyone who had suddenly become rich in those years, but if they didn't narrow down the circle of suspects, it would be very difficult for them. The detectives believed that if they started searching now, they would definitely find the criminals. If they were still alive, they would no longer be able to hide from justice. The meeting was completed with a 97% success rate. The X10 invisible detector, which worked with an accuracy of 10 meters and could detect listening devices, cameras, and other surveillance devices, as well as show their location within 10 minutes. Wang Fei heard the guy's voice asking if she was waiting for him to relax in pleasant company and drink a glass of wine. The forensic expert looked at the guy. She waited for the detective to solve the crime and find the culprits. The doctor also told the police officer that the autopsy results of the deceased were already ready. The hero learned from the report that the mine collapsed due to an explosion, and all 5 victims had marks from the shockwave on their bodies. But it is unknown whether they died as a result of the explosion or whether it happened after everyone was dead. Ropes were found near the bodies, suggesting that everyone had been tied up and that even during the collapse the lacing was still on them. The driver's body was found to have bruises and stab wounds, one of which was near the heart, which could have been the cause of his death. The police station was buzzing and living its own life. Workers were talking among themselves. Many did not believe that the young man would be smart enough to solve another case, for which he would have to bother a little. There were rumors among the detectives that since Zhao Yu found the bag and the victim's family gave him 100 or even 200,000 in money, he was incredibly rich. The guy had no time for his colleagues' conversations. He was completely immersed in his thoughts about the autopsy results. The only thing that interested him was the unsolved case. Captain Mao entered the department. Everyone present rushed to greet him, since the chief had only recently been discharged from the hospital and a lot had happened during his absence. The guys were very irritated by their colleagues, who always thought only about money and food, and compared to Ku Ping, who squeezed every last drop out of herself, were just trash. Zhao Yu burst into anger. If the men had more interesting matters to deal with than the investigation, then it would be better for them to do so elsewhere. There were still detectives working in the department, and empty talk was really interfering with them and distracting them. The head of the city council, the director, did not understand why the young man was doing things so that all his teammates would hate him. The forensic expert greeted the director, although it was unclear why he had come into the department, since this was not at all part of the duties of the chairman of the council. The husband put his hand on the guy's shoulder, which distracted him greatly, but the manager urgently needed his nephew's attention. What the police heard was like a bolt from the blue, because no one expected that Zhao Yua had such a high-ranking relative. This topic would be discussed in all offices for weeks to come. The husband asked the young man to follow him, because he had a very important matter to discuss with the guy, which urgently needed to be discussed. The hero looked at the stranger and could not understand what he needed and who he even was. The detective couldn't understand what business the director might have with him. The man was certainly up to something, but it was still unclear what exactly. The city council leader closed his eyes and took a sip of refreshing water. He had done all he could. The departing husband asked the young man to try not to show his character in the future and to try hard, which surprised the guy very much. Everyone was very curious about what the director could talk about with Zhao Yua. So the men began to befriend what they thought was an influential person. The guy had nothing to please his colleagues with, because the conversation was the most ordinary and inconspicuous, and the young man himself did not know why the man asked him to step aside with him. The other police officers were not at all happy with this answer, but since the detective was the director's favorite, he had the right to keep everything a secret. The young man stood on the edge of a cliff and looked down into a very deep abyss. If he fell from there, there was almost no chance of survival. The boy thought that this was the very place where the kidnappers demanded ransom, despite the voice of Li Winey calling him. The girl screamed with all her might into the elder's ear to reach him, which almost left the guy deaf. The detective was very angry about his assistant's actions, but she called him several times to find out if the hero had any new ideas. Zhao Yu shared with the lady the information that when the children's parents approached the cliff, they saw the radios that the kidnappers had prepared for them. At least one of the criminals had to be near this place and observe the actions of the victims. The relatives were forced to stand at the red line drawn by the killers and throw bags of money in the same place, so there had to be another kidnapper there. But children could not be left unattended, so there had to be a third accomplice. According to Ku Ping's report, they were able to take the money under police surveillance, reveal their tracks, and were also aware of the bugs in the bag and were fully aware of all the actions, so they either worked in the department before or had their own man there. The explosives found in the mine were similar to those usually used for blasting operations. Perhaps there was some kind of detonator among the criminals. The young man picked up the telephone receiver and answered the call because someone really wanted to talk to him and kept calling him on the phone. The information that the young man heard surprised him very much and made him nervous because he had to play the role of a hooligan. The man lay pinned to the floor, his face twisted in pain. The guy looked down on the worthless. They thought that no one had crossed their path yet and how badly this could all end for them. The young man raised his new acquaintance's head so that he would look at him and remember that from now on he would call him Brother Tianlu. And their senior boss Liang was sitting at a table nearby. During the interrogation, the detective learned that the man in glasses gave the robbers 20,000 each so that they would throw out all the customers and cause chaos in the restaurant. The detective ordered the robbers to leave the money and get out of the establishment, and in the future to think about who to work for, because it could cost more than a few teeth. A dark shadow came over the detective's face when one of the robbers said that he didn't have any cash on him. But he quickly got the hint and immediately found the necessary amount to pay on the spot. Without any embarrassment, Su Yun laughed out loud. His subordinate played the role of the criminal simply brilliantly. Even he believed it, and for the gang, he now forever became the senior boss Liang. The young man immediately realized that the petty thieves were new to the criminal world and had no experience. The boss suddenly became serious again. He informed the guy that on the matter they had recently discussed, he would accept his answer as consent. The husband invited the guy to become a special investigator of the disciplinary inspection department in the future. When he encounters similar situations, he must arrange a showdown and involve as many people as possible who were noticed in criminal activity. Today, the red-faced guy revealed his true identity to the guy. He came to the city to conduct an investigation. The head of supervision, it was just undercover work. I didn't expect that the guy would turn out to be such a professional bandit that he even forced the criminals to reveal the name of one of their main ones. The detective not only looked like a gangster, he seemed to be one, which surprised Su Yun greatly. The new friends had a good time, celebrating a successfully completed business and a collaboration that promised to be very fruitful. An unpleasant thought struck Zhao Yua. He remembered his acquaintance from his past life, also a professional. The guy jumped up and ran to the exit. He had an urgent matter to do. He needed to urgently test his own theory. The boss sighed with understanding. He understood who he was hiring and that the guy would never be able to sit in one place for long. QN prison was a special place where the most dangerous criminals were kept in custody and who should never be released into society. A tall elderly man in handcuffs walked into the room. He had spent more than 1 year in this place for his crime. The criminal took a chair opposite the detective, who carefully watched every tiny movement. The guy knew the man sitting in front of him very well. In the kidnapping case, this man was the best professional. Jiao Hai was guilty of kidnapping and murder, and his 2 accomplices were shot, serving a life sentence because his victim died of a heart attack. He was, one might say, a master of his craft. The detective didn't waste time on pleasantries, but got straight to the point. He was interested in the situation in which a criminal could kill his hostage. The man sentenced to life imprisonment was very surprised. He was exhausted by such a question from the policeman. He did not expect anything like this. Jiao Hai was very annoyed to hear such words addressed to him because the officer read his file. That woman simply had a heart attack and he did not kill her. The purpose of the kidnapping was only ransom. No one wants to kill hostages. The young man was shocked by the prisoner's violent reaction. Tears could be seen in his eyes, very unexpected, but the guy needed the accidental killer to pull himself together and calm down. Zhao Yu explained that he had come from a completely different case that he was investigating. He only needed information from the convict, and his case did not interest the boy at all. The hero even promised that if the man proved useful, he would help the prisoner get out of prison and someday see freedom not through bars. The criminal, like many at the time, heard about this case. There are many reasons for killing hostages. For example, the victim could see the kidnapper's face, and he was very afraid of exposing himself. Perhaps the victim's family did not cooperate with them and contacted the police. Perhaps the hostages had health problems. Perhaps they even tried to escape and everything ended badly. But it seemed to the man that M's case was not one of those. The husband believed that real psychopaths were involved in this case because they kidnapped the poor children, took all the money, and simply killed them without showing any humanity. Besides, taking the driver hostage made no sense. They could only kidnap the children and send Niu Weiguang to their families with a ransom demand. Or they could give him a knife with blood and scare the parents so that they would quickly hand over all the money. The criminal said he would be an idiot to take such a strong guy hostage. It was very risky, which led the detective to think that the driver could also be involved. The man continued to chatter non-stop, and the young man thought that there was another prisoner in this prison who could help him find answers to many questions. Another criminal was brought into the interrogation room, and in order to at least slightly win the prisoner's favor, the detective took out a lighter and helped him light a cigarette. Yang Wentao, because he is also known as the murderer who drowned the victim in the Q reservoir and was caught by Officer Zhao in the mine where the ransom bag and the bodies of the dead were found, did not know how he could be of use to the young man. The guy also lit a cigarette. This conversation could be very long, because he wanted to know how the killer found the mine where she was hiding. In the first years, mining operations in the city's mines were contracted to private individuals. If anyone had money, they could invest it in research into some of the mines, thus testing their metal. The chance to get rich was incredible if the fossils had discovered silver or some other expensive metals and valuables. As what was there was empty, the result could have been very disastrous for the investor. On the drawings, these shafts were shown as empty because they said that there was nothing there. And the criminal had not known anything about that cave before. He was simply trying to escape from the officer pursuing him. The killer was thinking about who had installed the fence behind which he was hiding, and believed that it had been there for a very long time. And the guy was also interested in whether the prisoner knew who had signed the contract for that particular mine. A wealthy man named Chen Sanli was buying the area, and the company the man worked for was supposed to get permission for contractors to carry out the project. But he was already dead when they found him, and the family of the deceased was left broke and homeless. Zhao Yu looked closely at the criminal. The information he provided was not much, but it allowed him to at least work and make progress on the case. At the head office of Branch R, Ku Ping asked the young man again if she had heard Chen Sanli's name correctly. The detective came to the conclusion that one of the kidnappers could have been the deceased. Having received the money, he signed a contract for that mine, but he had a conflict with his partner, as a result of which he died, and the family was left on the street. The policewoman agreed that the theory was indeed very plausible and promised to send people to get information about the millionaire. The guy once again surprised his senior colleague. She didn't expect that someone would decide to ask the criminals themselves for advice in order to find new leads. The young man was very proud of himself and believed that the girl should have expected some kind of similar trick from him, since they had known each other for several days. The lady interrupted the detective by pressing her hand firmly over his mouth. This trick was very unexpected for the guy and surprised him very much. The leader of Group B couldn't listen to this self-admiration from the guy any longer. As soon as she started praising Zhao Yua, he immediately recognized it. The hero was very amused by the girl's behavior, and he believed that as soon as they opened the case, the beauty was obliged to give him half of her bonus, which she did not agree with under any circumstances. To thank the detective for his help, Ku Ping offered to join him for a delicious dinner and brighten up the evening with interesting conversations. The guy decided to accept the girl's offer, but on one condition. He had to pay for dinner himself. The happy encounter was completed with a degree of 76%, and the hero received a new invisible night vision device. The guy worked all night and fell asleep at his desk in the R department. But at 7 in the morning, he was awakened by the persistent drilling of a landline phone. Without even waking up or getting up from his makeshift bed, the detective decided to pick up the phone and answer the call. From what he heard, the young man's eyes opened very quickly. Drowsiness left his body, and its place was taken by a primordial, all-consuming horror. The news completely threw the detective off his game. The telephone receiver fell out of his hands and landed on the concrete floor, breaking into many small pieces, just like the guy's heart. The sky was covered with gray clouds, and it seemed that even nature itself was crying bitter tears. Feeling the pain of people, Zhao Yu arrived at the scene where there were already several police patrols. The guy was very tired from running fast, but now he was least worried about this. An angry grimace froze on the hero's face. Now he looked more like a beast cornered in a mouth than a living person. The guy did not understand why everyone froze and did nothing. It was necessary to urgently help the victim, call an ambulance, take her to the hospital, do at least something, but the gloomy expressions on the doctors' faces spoke for themselves. Zhang Jingfeng was drenched in cold sweat. He, like everyone else present, was having a very hard time. The only thing he could tell the guy was to calm down and pull himself together. Li Weini couldn't hold back her tears. This day was one of the most terrible not only in her life, but also in the entire police department as a whole. The mask of hatred flew off the guy's face, and its place was taken by uncontrollable pain that pierced his entire body. From his heels to the top of his head, he could no longer hold back his trembling and sobbing. It couldn't be Ku Ping, she couldn't be dead. But still, in the middle of the gloomy city, surrounded by police squads, lay the captain of Group B, already inanimate, with her eyes wide open. Wang Fei sat down by the girl's body, checking the latter for any indicators. Hope still glimmered in the doctor's soul. She did not want to lose someone close to her. Zhao Yu walked among the police officers and tried to prove to everyone that the beauty was alive, just unconscious, and needed immediate help. The forensic expert saw that the young man was going through a fit of hysteria, and no longer able to keep his distance. She grabbed the boy by the shirt with one hand and slapped him with all her might with the other. The hero had to take matters into his own hands here and now, because everyone needed a detective, not a frightened boy, and most of all, Ku Ping needed him now. Tears streamed down Zhao Yua's face as he finally realized that the girl would never enter the police station again. She was dead. Sister Xing told the boss that they had to take the body to the department for tests because they had to find out the cause of their colleague's death. The department chairman ordered Luan Xiaozhan to take a few guys and lift the victim, but no one dared to take a step when the hero approached the dead woman. The guy lifted the lifeless body into his arms. He couldn't allow anyone to defile the girl with their dirty touches. None of the policemen were worth a hair of hers. The young man carried the most devoted of the officers to the department with his own hands. Now her body seemed too light, almost weightless, which once again reminded him that the handsome man no longer had a glimmer of life. At the R police station, a human search specialist was reporting on the death of Ku Ping. Yesterday at 1 a.m., when the policewoman was driving home on the road, an unpleasant incident occurred. Clear traces of braking could be seen near the car, but no collision occurred, so it could be assumed that a pedestrian appeared in front of her and the girl immediately pressed the brake and got out of the car to check if everything was okay. At which point she received a stab wound. Unfortunately, there were no surveillance cameras installed on the police car, and there were repairs going on J Street, where all the events took place, so there was no way to verify the guesses. The detective did not agree with the police conclusion that it was a routine robbery that had gone according to plan, because if the criminal had been planning a simple theft, he would have fled as soon as he saw a policewoman in uniform. There were multiple stab wounds on the body, which did not at all resemble a premeditated murder, but rather resembled criminal intent disguised as a robbery. The young man's eyes widened at the following opinion, because if the girl was not killed by accident, then who exactly benefited from her death? The memory itself emerged from the depths of memory, because the day before the young man from Kuping had talked about a guy named Chen Sanli to search for information about whom the beauty was supposed to send people. The guy couldn't believe it. Could it really be connected to their suspect? Could it really be his information that led to the death of his colleague? Wang Fei entered the conference room, carefully examining something in the folder she was holding in her hands among the documents. Something strange was noted. Something did not match. The medical examiner reported that the autopsy results had come back, and although there were multiple stab wounds on the police officer's body, the fatal one was the one aimed at her back, hitting her right in the heart area and breaking all the bones in its path. The doctor's words confirmed the young man's worst suspicions. It seemed the killer was clearly a professional in his field. A knife with blood on it, bearing the fingerprints of someone named Hao Meng, was found about a kilometer from the city where the colleague was found in a garbage container. According to the police information network, the suspect had the victim's handbag. The criminal was quite well known among the police, since he had previously been imprisoned for robbery and possession of firearms. While the other detectives decided to go and avenge their colleague, Zhao Yu was looking through the video evidence that the police had found. The video, which was filmed near the crime scene, showed the suspect without a knife in his hand, although the weapon was found 1 kilometer from the street where the murder took place. Moreover, the recording showed that the suspect's condition was not entirely adequate, which would hardly have allowed him to defeat such an experienced officer as Ku Ping. The veins on the detective's cheekbones were deflated. His face was crawling. His eyes were red. Even his teeth seemed to have taken on some kind of inhuman shape. So much anger had taken hold of him. If the guy from the video was involved, then he clearly wasn't acting alone. Closer to midnight, all members of the fallen captain's team gathered again at the police station. While everyone was discussing how they still couldn't find Ho Meng's whereabouts despite searching all known locations, the detective stood silently by the girl's former desk. The guy looked at the photo of the beauty and overheard that, at the moment, all the patrols were watching the suspect's girlfriend's bar and his friend Li Chunhua. But if the criminal didn't show up in 24 hours, it would be very difficult to find him. Still staring at the photograph, the detective spoke up, reminding his colleagues that last night they were looking for information about a man named Chen Sanli. Just last night, Senior Officer Ku Ping had sent her subordinates home and ordered them to get a good rest, as they were facing a difficult day of searching for a suspect in a child abduction case. The red-haired guy told the guy that they had not found any information about the person he was interested in because everyone had gone home. The junior employee wanted to take his boss home because it seemed to him that she was not feeling very well. But the captain brushed off the young man's concerns and said that she was fine, and that they would meet tomorrow. The red-haired youth could no longer hold back his tears. If he had insisted and given the captain a ride, none of this would have happened. Zhou Yua had no time for the personal experiences of the employees. He still could not take his point of view away from the photo of the dead policewoman and also felt partly guilty about it. The hero recalled the girls' soup in the evenings that they spent together in an empty precinct during an investigation, as well as her rare praise. The young man recalled the officer's bright smile, as well as the promise of a delicious dinner together, which was never destined to take place. The detective squeezed the victim's thin bracelet with 2 cubes into his fist. He would not let her die in vain and would find not only the criminal in M's case, but also the one who dared to attack the best of the police officers. All the conversations in the office suddenly stopped and all eyes were on Zhao Yua. He had a way to get this Hao Meng to come out of hiding. The boy turned over his shoulder to the police. He needed the help of the bravest of them, the one who would not be afraid to risk his own life to find justice, the one who was ready to go with him right now. It was already evening on the streets of the city of Q. The alleys, streets, and avenues were barely illuminated by the street lamps, although the window of one of the local bars was glowing no worse than a Christmas tree. Opening the door with his foot, an old acquaintance of his, once a small-time swindler from a restaurant, was walking towards the detective, and now he worked for him. The guy waited for news. Taking another drag on his cigarette, the time for civilized methods was in the past, and now the criminals had made a huge mistake and crossed the line completely. The subordinates reported to the officer that they had found Ho Meng's girlfriend, and that he had called her in the morning, saying that he had gotten into serious trouble, that he needed to lie low, and that he had come to ask for help from someone named Lee Chonghua. The guy exhaled acrid smoke that burned not only his lungs, but also his soul, and asked the robbers if the girl had received her punishment. The bastards knew their business, and although the bar owner resisted for a long time, they found a way to solve her language, although it meant leaving several of her bones intact. During the operation, the officer who was supposed to look after Hao Meng's girlfriend had to be restrained because he did not want to give the criminals complete freedom of action. Considering it unlawful, the detective threw away his cigarette butt and left the scene. He would definitely fire his colleague soon, but at the moment he had much more important things to do. The collectors remained standing with the twisted policeman near the car. Their boss could rely on them in any case. They would not let him down under any circumstances. Zhao Yu and two other colleagues were walking through the dark streets of the city. The time for playing by the rules had passed when the criminals decided to kill one of them. As expected, the girl found the police officers. They had obviously been in touch after that event. The boys also heard that Li Chonghua had great connections in the government and that his tea club also had many henchmen. The second suspect had already been interrogated, but he said that he did not know the husband and the young police officers did not know what to do if he did not confess this time either. All this time, Zhao Yu was looking out the window. It seemed like he was completely oblivious to the conversations in the car, but those present realized that he could hear them when the boy asked if any of them had brought a firearm with them. It was quite quiet in the huge, luxurious, classical-style mansion on the outskirts of the city until the police burst in. The men with badges and guns asked everyone to remain calm, do whatever they were told and not to interfere with the investigation, and most importantly, not to resist. In the center of the room, surrounded by a crowd of people with his feet up on the table, sat the head of the house. He had lived in this area for many years and had never had anything against all the respected police. The owner of the estate did not even raise an eyebrow at the arrival of the young people, because even their leader was afraid to cross the man, knowing that the consequences could be too serious. Li Chonghua didn't believe that a group of police officers with milk on their lips could pose a serious threat to him. The owner of the house mocked the newly arrived guests, believing that his connections and acquaintances made him invulnerable. With one strong wave of his hand, Zhao Yu knocked the arrogance off the very arrogant man, who did not expect that the guy could still dare. The guy with connections flew halfway across the room, overturning the table on which he had been leisurely folding his lower limbs. The owner of the short beard could not believe that this unworthy man not only touched him without permission, but also rolled his fist across his face. The detective pinned the owner of the house to the floor with his boot, and he got seriously scared and realized that his affairs were not looking good right now. A devilish light lit up the young man. He needed information about Ho Meng's current location, and he was ready to get it by any means, no matter the consequences. While the owner of the estate kept repeating that the police had no idea what they had signed up for and that they would not leave there unharmed, his security finally realized that some psycho had dared to hit their boss. The hero turned his head slightly towards his comrades and gave them a small sign that could be missed if you did not watch the young man. The red-haired police officer understood the silent signal from his comrade. He knew that the most interesting part of the show was about to begin. The guy who had been ignored for a long time received a firearm and fired one shot into the ceiling, drawing attention to himself. Everyone in the room felt their ears pop from the loud sound, and a sharp pain numbed their bodies. The young man's face began to lose its human features. Now he looked more like a beast that brings only death and destruction. As always, when it came to the murder of Ku Ping, the young man with the wild look warned that if anyone took even one step, they would be shot as an accomplice to the crime. A whisper ran through the hall. No one knew that Li Huanghua had killed a man. Otherwise, they would never have helped him. The detective continued to put pressure on his interlocutor because he considered him an intelligent man and should have understood that if it were not for the order from above, the young officers would not have dared to disturb such a respected man. The owner of the estate realized in time that he had to start telling the truth. Otherwise, the boy could use force. Zhao Yu listened carefully to his opponent, but still did not remove his raised leg from the man's lower limb. The guy, who had his arrogance knocked down in front of all his guests, smiled and said that he didn't know where his friend had gone, but would be happy to help the police find him. The veins under the hero's eye began to pulse. His retina became bloodshot. The guy really didn't like it when people lied to him, and he could feel it several kilometers away. He wouldn't forgive this worm for lying so easily. The officer lowered his recently raised leg with all his might, and a loud crunch could be heard under the soles of his boots. Li Huanhua fell on his back and grabbed his sore leg, the pain racking his body and preventing him from thinking clearly. The man opened his eyes and looked at his executioner. He was scared and understood that it was time to pay for all his sins. The owner of the house begged the young man to stop and not to continue. He was ready to confess everything and give the young man his last, no matter what he asked the young man to do to stop this suffering. Hao Meng was hiding in the huge warehouse N. He had no idea that his best friend had traded his freedom and life for his own interests. The night was quiet and unremarkable. The stars silently watched through the sparse clouds the events unfolding on the ground. A small police squad was moving quickly between the buildings of Warehouse N. They had already called the captain and asked him to send reinforcements to their location as soon as possible. The red-haired guy reported to the chief that anonymous sources had informed them of Ho Man's location. Having finished talking on the phone, the young man turned to the hero. They needed to search the train, but it was too big, and they didn't know where the criminal was, so they needed to decide on further actions. Whether to split up? There was no more time to wait. Perhaps their people were following Chunhua, but it was not known exactly how she contacted the guy, and if he found out that the police had already come for him, he would run away again. While the detectives were checking the map for any strange movements of the terrain, a tired, fair-haired man emerged from the warehouse buildings behind them. The officers turned to look at the guy. They couldn't believe their own nature, because in front of them stood the long-wanted criminal. It took Hao Meng a few long seconds to think about the whole situation and realize that those guys had come specifically for him. The probable killer of the policewoman decided not to stand there like a pillar for long and ran away as fast as he could, straight away from the detective who had almost caught up with him. The bad guy demanded that the criminal stop immediately and surrender to justice. Then perhaps they would act at least a little more gently. Hao Meng, paying attention to the threat of the detectives, tried to run as quickly as possible to the shelter of one of the warehouse buildings. The police followed the fugitive into the hangar. They were a little exhausted by this chase, but now they were calm. Because the killer had nowhere else to run, he was trapped almost in their hands. Zhao Yu realized that everything was not just like that. Why would the criminal run to a place where he would definitely be caught if he could wander endlessly between the warehouse buildings? A bright light hit the guy's eyes, blinding him and all his companions for a few seconds, which allowed the killer to fully unfold his plan. When the young man's eyes got used to the new lighting, a huge room appeared before him, with beds along the walls and one man sitting on each of them, who were not very happy to see the police. The hero's smile turned into an evil grin. He realized that it would now be much more difficult to take Ho Ming. The criminal informed the other fugitives that the men chasing him were police officers and that they had to be stopped before help arrived and stole their stash. A huge crowd rushed towards the detectives like a black wave. They grabbed everything that was at hand and could be used as a weapon: sticks, bats, or even metal pipes. The two men, led by Zhao Yue, stood and waited to see what would happen next. They were no longer afraid of anything. They were simply preparing for the skirmish that was inevitable. The first attacker who approached the detective instantly found himself on the floor. The guy was physically very strong and resilient, had a good command of martial arts, so he was not worried about the fight. Striking blow after blow in different directions, the hero ordered his comrades not to waste time and to quickly go and seize Ho Meng. The police officers rushed to the exit, but the attackers did not want to let them go so quickly. There were many more of them, and they quickly caught up with the young people. The detective realized that no one was covering his back when one of the robbers attacked him from behind and grabbed him in delight, tightly wrapping his arms around the young man's neck and body. The young man's extensive sparring experience helped him get out of the situation easily. He pressed the attacker with his body against the metal bunk bed behind him with all his might. Another robber approached the guy from the other side. He swung a wooden stick at the guy and landed it with all his might on the boy's head, causing the club to shatter into several pieces. Zhao Yue's face was partially dyed red from the side. It even seemed like he had been doused with bright crimson paint. The young man's demonic mask blocked his view again. He turned to his attacker. His gaze did not promise anything good. He looked as if he promised that this would be the criminal's last day. The criminals recoiled at the sight of the detective. He was simply unbending, as if he were made of iron, not muscle and bone. The police officer's partners noticed a new wound on the guy's face, and this worried them very much. They tried to bring him to his senses, but he was already aiming for his victims. The young man clutched a piece of wood tightly in his hand and, turning to face the thief, brought the piece of wood down on him. Ku Ping's death revealed the deepest parts of the young man's soul and released all the demons from there, who no longer planned to return. and the attackers only made him thirstier for blood. Seeing his friend die, one of the fugitives grabbed a short metal sword and rushed towards the detective to get even with him. The second half of the wooden stick ended up in the chest of the unsuccessful assassin with the iron sword. He screamed at the top of his lungs from the pain in his body. The young man felt no emotion as he scattered the fugitives to different corners of the room, warm crimson rivers flowing around them. The scream of the criminal broke the silence in the hangar for a short time. He grabbed the wooden stake in horror, not knowing what to do next. A colleague, equally frightened and confused, ran towards the man. The detective, with bloody hands, picked up the iron that one of the fugitives had used to attack him, which further frightened those who had recently been moving in a huge crowd towards him and the other two police officers. The people parted around the young man, forming a semicircle of frightened people who did not know how to deal with one man. A shadow loomed over the wounded man, like a harbinger of imminent punishment for all his sins. Moments of his short life fluttered before the criminal's eyes. Among the criminals, there was one brave one who took up a piece of metal, but even his knees trembled at the thought of what he was about to do. Taking their cue from the brave man, some of the owners of the premises also decided to pick up the previously lost weapons while the guy was not paying attention to them. The boy walked through the living corridor of people with an indifferent expression on his face, paying no attention to anyone except his goal. Having dealt with all the obstacles, the police still went after Ho Meng's tracks, since there were no cars nearby. He could not have disappeared too far. Zhao Yu suddenly stopped. Around the corner, he saw something that could speed up the search for the killer a little and reduce his chances of escaping the scene unnoticed. The system was again able to guess what exactly the guy would need in a difficult situation when he was given a universal key. The guy sat on top of the iron horse, pressing the clutch pedal. It was his first experience, but he loved fast driving and very quickly figured out how to control it. The young man was about to set off, but his plans were interrupted by the sound of a shot, which meant that there was some kind of danger nearby. A red-haired colleague appeared from behind one of the buildings. The guy didn't look his best. He was bent over and was very tired, apparently from the fast chase. The hero drove closer to the policeman to find out if everything was okay with him, but he told him that Ho Meng was only a few meters away from them and was armed, so he definitely needed to be arrested. The detective rushed along the trail. He was sure that his partner was leading them correctly. He could be relied upon and trusted. He would definitely detain the suspect. The fugitive's strength was already running out. He didn't know how much longer he could run, but he felt the presence of police officers behind him and couldn't allow himself to stop even for a second to rest. Turning around at the sound of the roaring engine, the criminal saw the leader of the squad riding a motorcycle, who was almost breathing down his neck. The killer stopped, took a firearm out of his pocket, and closing his eyes tightly in fear, fired one shot. When the man opened his eyes, his surprise knew no bounds. What he saw was beyond his comprehension and at the same time shocked him. An iron horse was riding towards Ho Meng at high speed, blinding with its bright headlights. But the rider was not visible. The motorcycle stopped right in front of the confused criminal, who couldn't understand how the detective had disappeared into thin air. An invisible force caused the man to lose his balance and he fell backwards onto the asphalt, hitting his tailbone painfully. The criminal did not pay attention to the pain in his back where he landed. He curled up into a ball, but his stomach hurt even more for reasons unknown to him. A huge barrel of fuel hung over the fugitive's head, as if it were being held by a ghost. Some evil force was clearly at work in this alley. The metal piece of iron, reflected off the suspect's face, rolled further down the street, as if it had already done all its business here and was no longer needed by anyone. The husband grabbed his nose. His face hurt a lot, but he was even more confused by the question of what to do next, how to defeat what the eyes cannot see. What sense organ could be used in such a fight? The system reported that the time of use of the invisible suit had expired, and a policeman with a furious look and a gun in his hands began to appear in front of the killer. The happy encounter ended with a 96% success rate, and an invisible breathing apparatus was obtained that can supply oxygen for 10 minutes. While at the department, the guy met with Miss Wang. Although he asked her to be a little softer today, she acted too harshly. The hero clung to the doctor's coat with all his might. The veins on his arms bulged. He was still a living person and not a soulless machine, as many believed. The beauty looked at the officer carefully, holding his face by the chin. Today, her rudeness was completely justified. The girl knew that the detective was in pain. This process could not bring any pleasure, but there was no other way to stitch up his wound. The doctor finished stitching the wound. It was neat and even. It was obvious that the forensic expert had done this often, but the young man still needed to make an appointment at the hospital for a full examination. Wang Fei was worried that, in addition to the cut, the boy might have a concussion or even more serious injuries, which could lead to further health problems later. The guy brushed off his concerned colleague. Now he felt much better, and the wound seemed like just a small scratch. In another life, he had experienced much more serious injuries and was always able to cope with everything. Out of the corner of his eye, the young man noticed something incomprehensible, which only created questions in his wild imagination. The captain pierced Zhao Yu with a fiery gaze. He did not understand why the girl was looking at him so attentively, because nothing supernatural had happened. The lady had to keep an eye on the guy, otherwise he could lose his temper again and do something that would have negative consequences not only for himself, but for the entire police department. The door of the room opened with a dull thud, and a man flew into the room, surprising everyone present with his appearance, who were not expecting guests at all. In front of the detective stood his red-haired colleague and two other officers, all dressed in dress uniform, saluting him. The policemen were members of Group B and, on behalf of their late Captain Ku Ping, tearfully thanked the young man for helping them catch the killer. Previously, the team didn't really like the guy, but now everything has changed and they promise to help at any time if he calls them. But the young man said that everything is fine because the deceased was his friend and there is no need for gratitude. This was not all the news for Zhao Yua. The boss called him into his office and wanted to see him as soon as possible. Already in the office of the head of the department, the young man sincerely did not understand why the chief wanted to remove him from work. The young man believed the detective had abused his authority by hiring people to interrogate the suspect's girlfriend, interfering with the officer's investigation, and ultimately injuring the man's leg. 12 people were hospitalized with serious injuries, 3 are still in hospital, and 1 is in critical condition under the supervision of doctors. The guy managed to create a lot of problems, and the officers did not behave like that. The young man did not agree because there were 40 attackers, and there were only 3 of them. And last night, they simply attacked in a huge crowd. The police were forced to defend themselves, so there was no time to pat them on the head while they were fighting back. The boss didn't like the guy's vanity. No one could contradict him. After all, they were the police officers and bore full responsibility for all their actions. The guy didn't back down. He tried to convey to the man that before Ku Ping's death, they had investigated the M case together, and there was a high probability that these 2 cases were connected. Video from the scene of the officer's murder showed Hu Meng leaving, but there was no footage of him arriving at the scene. There was no suspect, no weapon, but it was found kilometers from the scene in a dumpster on the other side, which means he had an accomplice, or someone just set the guy up. The guy was getting angry. The killer knew more and more about every step of his victim, which suggests that he was clearly not just passing by. Perhaps they had a mole in the police station and the guy had to immediately solve this case. No matter how calm he tried to explain to Zhao Yua that when solving crimes, you need to have strong evidence. So a lawsuit against him was already being prepared and the guy should have known about it. If the boy hadn't caught Hao Meng, he would have been put in jail long ago. His husband had to endure the scolding of his superiors, so he should have been grateful that he didn't have to leave his job. The detective braced his foot on the chief's desk and pushed him with all his might, the heavy wooden piece of furniture sliding across the concrete floor. No one had the right to talk to the young man like that. The glass goblet fell with a loud crash. Just like the men's relationship, it shattered into hundreds of small pieces. Xiao Yu gestured that he thought about this situation. If the boss didn't want him to work, then let him solve all his own problems. The system reported that the happy encounter was completed with a degree of 85% and a universal unlocker was received. Ku Ping was sitting on a chair with a casual look, eating lunch, but that didn't explain how she ended up there. The sincere girl was surprised by the young man's question, but did not show it and asked with a smile where else she could be besides this place. The guy was silent. His face was covered in smoke. He didn't want to say obvious things known to both of them, because the girl couldn't be here. She was no longer alive. The beauty took a sip of her drink. Who knows? Maybe the young man just really wanted to have lunch with her after he finished the job. The detective felt very guilty, because if he hadn't forced the police to look for information about Chen Sanli, perhaps nothing would have happened. One of the top captains rolled her eyes, sighing heavily as much as she could. This guy is playing the hero. How can he be sure that these 2 cases are connected? Raising his glass, The detective promised that he would definitely find the one who did this to the girl, no matter how difficult it would be or how long it would take. He would get them out from under the ground. Ku Ping also raised her glass. Looking at the guy, she didn't doubt him for a second. Tears streamed from under the detective's closed eyes. The dream was both beautiful and very painful. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Zhao Yu knew that all of this was unrealistic, but he would definitely keep the promise he made to his fallen colleague. Finally, the funeral ceremony for the deceased girl began. After an autopsy and all investigative actions, her body was handed over to her relatives. A large number of Ku Ping's family members, friends, and colleagues gathered in the Great Hall. No one believed that they would no longer hear the girl's voice and laughter or see her face. The deceased's husband was holding their little daughter in his arms. The girl was crying because she didn't understand why her mother wasn't waking up and why her father didn't want to wake her up so that they could all play together again. No matter how the guy had to return to the department and continue investigating M's case, he had to find out why the captain was killed. Otherwise, he would never forgive himself. The hero's thoughts were interrupted by a loud vibration of his mobile phone. The young man did not think that at such a moment someone could disturb him. And did he think that at that moment everyone was saying goodbye to the magnificent policeman? The young man took the device out of his pocket and noticed that he was being bothered by an unknown number that was not among his contacts. The voice on the phone told Zhao Yua that the car was parked to his left and didn't even ask, but rather ordered the young man to come over alone and as quickly as possible. The guy looked at the man who had recently called him on the phone and didn't understand why this annoying guy needed him again. The detective, remembering his desire to return to the department as soon as possible, nevertheless asked Director Liao what his orders would be and whether the young man could help in any way. The boss silently got out of the driver's seat and walked to the back door. The guy didn't understand why there was such secrecy. It was as if he was talking to a spy from a James Bond movie. The man still didn't say a word. He reached out his hand to the door handle and pulled it open. In the back seat of the car sat the director of the R department, Jing Zhengbang, who was currently, according to information available to most people, recovering from an illness. The detective didn't know what to say. He was speechless from shock because he didn't understand why a not-so-high-ranking person would need him. Finally, the older man spoke, breaking the silence. He didn't tell the boy to get him up right away. He had to take the flowers and honor Ku Ping's memory. When the guy finally got the boss into a wheelchair, he decided that he wanted to ask the young man something. The site director bowed his head. He absolutely needed to know how exactly the captain had died, or whether Ho Meng had been involved in her murder. Zhao Yu didn't answer for a while. He was distracted from the conversation, or perhaps he was just taking a short break to think through his answer in detail. The rubber slipper that is usually worn in hospitals slipped off Jing Zhengbang's foot and fell onto the asphalt. Under the watchful gaze of the chief officer, the young man bent down and picked up his shoes. Without raising his head, the young man moved to sit next to the director, took his foot in his hands and returned the lost slipper to its place. This act was full of humility and respect for the older man. The men continued to move along the street of the city queue in the right direction, the elder sitting proudly in a wheelchair and the younger pushing him to the place where the funeral service was to be held. Under the gaze of the shocked new moon, another slipper flew down the street, although the main one pretended not to notice anything and did not understand what was happening. Recently, I was sure that the man couldn't move his legs because he had just asked me to lift him up and put him in a chair. Was he really just making fun of the gullible guy? The head of the station ordered the angry boy to bring his lost shoe as quickly as possible and put it on his foot. The young man found himself kneeling in front of the gray-haired man again, which he didn't like at all. The guy should have made him stand up and put on his shoes himself and not drag the slippers around like an obedient puppy. Unexpectedly, the bouquet that Jing Zhengbang was holding fell quite hard on the shocked guy's forehead. Was the old man really trying to piss him off in any way possible? Zhao Yu looked at the man with wide eyes. Did he really want the stitches on the guy's head to come apart? And the director did not pay the slightest attention to the hero's complaints and ordered him to be quickly rolled away because he wanted to get into the car. The young man was holding his hand to the injured area. This old man was clearly somewhat eccentric. Perhaps that was why they were keeping him in the hospital for so long. Mr. Jing said that if he died, this book should be cremated with him so that it would not fall into the wrong hands. Director Liang handed over a small notebook to the publisher Zhao Yua. Since he was the one who helped the chief, this thing now belonged to him. The guy wanted to know what happened, and the man told him that the boss had osteosarcoma. Amputation of both legs should have given him an extra 4 months of life. but he did not want to waste them in hospitals. Head of the finishing department walked deeper into the forest along a path when he asked the young man if he had ever heard of the massacre on Mount N. The book recorded 5 major national first-level cases, all of which were unsolved, and Mr. Jing personally investigated them. But he could not find anything else, so he decided that Zhou Yu would be his successor. He saw himself in the young man in his youth. The chief turned over his shoulder with a sly glance to see if the boy already felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. The guy grinned. He knew perfectly well that this piercing fox was up to something. The man was simply leading him by the nose to make him work for himself. Director Liang extended his hand to the young man, palm up. If he didn't want the book, he could take it back and never think about old unsolved cases again. You hid the notebook in the inside pocket of your jacket. He was someone who hated evil and supported justice and could not let murderers escape justice because that was his job. The young man shared with the older man that the last time he came to his office to help, he thought that something was wrong with the boss and that Mr. Jin had trusted him. Now the guy was tied hand and foot because he was suspended by Captain Zhou, and the young man would not be able to do anything if the director did not help him get his job back. The husband told the guy about the fact that there were no documents about the suspension and the boss just wanted to teach him a lesson. The hero didn't even guess how much and everything he had done for him, because if it weren't for the captain, he would have been in handcuffs for a long time. The detective had never looked at it from this angle, and it turned out that Zi Chunhua could not leave him alone and used his last connections to capture the young man. Zhao Yu was very angry. No one has the right to do this to him. He will take care of this reckless guy today. The young man turned around and walked away from Director Liang, and although he was now under fire and there was no point in creating additional problems, the guy assured him that the lawsuit against him would be closed soon, and then he would complete all of the old man's affairs. At the tea house, Boss G was asked how expensive the drink served there might be. The young man sat on a chair with a jar in his hands, but he was smiling. He would like to buy one as a gift in honor of the CEO. I am sure that to find the best one must ask a connoisseur of tea ceremonies, so I again came to an old friend. Zi Chunhua didn't expect such impudence. How dare this detective, because of whom he had already lost one limb and was moving around with the help of crutches, come to him. The owner of the house decided to show a little respect to the guest and asked him if he was so brave that he decided to come to him himself. The young man said that he wanted to turn their hostile relationship into a friendly one. That was why he had come today, and he asked if he could do a little housework and treat his husband. He offered the building 2 options for friendly negotiations. Either he would also put the guy on the miles, or he would bow low to the man and admit his mistake. Then he would be ready to forgive him. The guy forcefully landed a can of expensive tea on the armrest of an equally expensive chair. They would not have such a conversation. The detective made a devilish smile. He was just waiting for the moment when he could release his inner demon, because he had already been out of work for the last few days. Zi Chunhua was angry. He was already preparing for a new fight because he knew about the young man not only by hearsay when his phone rang loudly. The boss was informed that the police had been to the seafood store and had found contraband in the fish, and the police had also closed the karaoke room, saying that criminals were hiding there. The owner of the house leaned forward to take a closer look at the guy. He wouldn't be afraid of him because he had a lot of money and wouldn't miss some eateries. The young man touched the crime syndicate boss's forehead with 2 fingers, which completely threw him off his moral balance. Zhao Yu looked down at his opponent. The young man had just taken away his soul, and the man should either be more honest or next time he would not like the consequences. The evil Zi Chunhua headed deeper into the building that this guy was talking about. He was probably already completely crazy. The detective left the tea house with a pack of the boss's tea worth over 1,000. The enjoyment of a delicious secret dinner was interrupted by a loud ringing mobile phone. The boy called to ask when the boss would stop eating his pig and start dealing with the impudent young man, which made the man just go crazy. The guy didn't hang up, but continued talking about how his interlocutor loved Taiwanese wine and invited 3 men and a woman dressed as VIPs to dinner. Zi Chungu was very surprised by the detective's knowledge. Was he really watching the house and knowing everything that was going on there? The young man was not in the same house with her husband now, but thanks to the invisible surveillance camera he had attached, he knew about his every step and careless word. Was the man in the checkered shirt that the owner of the house invited to dinner a judge? And the girl with glasses also seemed very strange. She was from the prosecutor's office. The third guy was most likely a lawyer, Zhao Yu said on the phone. The young man's interlocutor was increasingly overcome with panic. If he knew what he was doing now, what other information the hero could have? The owner of the house finally lost control of the situation. He did not understand what was happening on his own estate. The young man did not leave his boss for a second. He saw the man not only during meals, but also when he decided to take a shower. The man couldn't just undress even in his own bathtub. He had to urgently find the camera through which they were spying on him. The policeman was having a blast, and he was very amused by the anger with which the boss of the mafia syndicate reacted to everything. The owner of the house became increasingly angry as the young man talked about his fair skin and the birthmarks near his belly button. The man could no longer stand this abuse. If this was the only filth pouring out of the phone, it would have been better without it at all. In the evening, Zi Chunhua returned home very tired. He was haunted by messages, but after he turned off the calls, this was the only way to communicate with his subordinates. As always, the husband was met at the door by his charming wife, who had missed her husband very much all day. The woman was about to hug and kiss her husband when their idyll was interrupted by the ringing of her phone. Mrs. Z handed the phone to the owner of the house, telling him that it was his voice that he would hear. Zhao Yu called. He was disappointed with his boss. Did he really think that if he just turned off his phone, he could continue to live his life peacefully without any consequences for his actions? What the man heard from the telephone receiver caused another wave of anger in him, because the young man was offering to put his wife, a beauty, on live air. It looks like another phone went out of business today at the hands of someone with very strong government connections. A young man with a very expensive package of tea came to the office of the branch manager R. Zhou. The young man charmingly smiled at his boss and told him that he had accidentally broken his cup, but was now ready to fix it, and asked if Zi Chunhua's complaint against him had now been withdrawn. Could he continue working? The head of the department did not understand why this guy was always so confident in himself, what his secret was. Zhao Yu wanted to correct his mistake. He considered himself kind and honest, and promised to repay kindness to a good person in the future. The director accepted the apology and decided to introduce him to the head of the B group in the criminal department, since he was already there. The detective turned around. He hadn't expected the news so quickly because everyone still remembered the recent tragedy that had befallen their precinct. A very familiar girl with a short haircut walked through the door. She was an excellent police officer and exactly the kind of captain this squad deserved. The beauty put her hand to her head in official congratulations. Officer Miao Ying reported for duty and was ready to accept all the duties assigned to her. The young man's eyes widened. Cold sweat broke out on his temples. Serious problems awaited him. Sparks flew between the young people. Everyone understood that it would not be easy to work, but the champion came to the department to replace the team, and no one could change that. The chief, not knowing about the long history of the policeman's acquaintance, decided to introduce them to each other, and Zhao Yu realized that this was a chance to fix their relationship and was the first to extend his hand to the girl. Adelok believed that it would be very useful for the detectives to work side by side. Although the karateka did not share his hopes and was very skeptical about this collaboration. The girl and I shook hands. Perhaps in the future they will be able to work somehow, but it will not be today. First, they need to somehow adapt to this information. Director Zhou asked the young man to give Captain Miao a tour of the site and bring her up to speed on all the work so that the girl could begin her duties as quickly and comfortably as possible. The system reported that the happy meeting was completed with a degree of 91%, and the young man also received a welding machine, which surprised him greatly. The angry girl walked down the corridor. The first one didn't like the idea of the main guy accompanying her at all, because she could perfectly well figure everything out and find the office herself. The young man wondered whether he should plant an invisible surveillance camera on the beauty to see where she lives and whether she is dating anyone. The new captain of Department B walked forward along the corridors, not looking back at the guy. She was not pleased with his company, and she wanted to be alone as quickly as possible, or at least without the guy behind her. Zhao Yu decided to be the first to break the silence and asked why the girl decided to move from the U section to theirs. Since she was also a captain there, perhaps something went wrong. The beauty blushed with anger, remembering the guy's kiss. How could such a shameless person, after that act, decide to speak to her in such a tone? The guy was happy with the lady's reaction. Perhaps the problem was not in quarrels with old colleagues, but maybe the lady simply wanted to see him as often as possible. Miao Ying's eyes widened at what she heard. She couldn't believe that the young man could even think about it. She didn't like the guy, and she didn't like being in his company at all. It was like torture. She decided to remind him who the real champion of elite fights was and to resolve their dispute in the usual manner. So she swung her foot at the guy in anger. The boy saw his colleague's intentions and did not understand why she was doing this, although he just wanted to joke and not bring everything to a senseless fight. A red-haired colleague came to Captain Joe to discuss Chung Sanli's involvement in the M case. They could not understand his motives for the kidnapping. The police officers felt the walls of the department shake, and it seemed to them that the whole world was shaking from a 9-point earthquake. Looking out into the hallway from the office, they saw the new captain of Team B doing a stretch over Zhao Yua's head. The force of the blow caused the men's eyes to roll out of their sockets. At the point of impact, a huge dent from the girl's leg was visible on the wall above the young man's head. The young man, with a cold sweat appearing on his face, congratulated his new friend Yao Hu and said that the beauty was the new leader of Team B, then asked him not to delay in congratulating the new captain. Zha Yu arrived at the Q Division Detention Center and reported that an officer from Department R wanted to call in suspect Ho Meng for questioning. The clerk asked him to wait a minute to verify the information he had provided. The detective decided that the only way to get to Chung Sanli was to use the invisible lie detector during the interrogation. The guy was so distracted by his own thoughts that he didn't even immediately hear the voice of the clerk who was addressing him. The man reported to the officer of the R department the suspect was already being interrogated by his colleague, whose name was indicated in the official documents. The papers indicated the name of the new captain of the department and the young man's old acquaintance Miao Ying. It seemed that they were thinking about the same thing again. A girl came out of the holding cell for the prisoner in the Ku Ping case. This conversation was a little difficult for her, because she also knew who she was dealing with and what exactly that person had done for the entire department. The beauty was completely immersed in her thoughts and was very surprised when a voice from the side asked her if she had already had lunch today. There was a guy sitting on the chairs in the hallway, holding a delicious-looking piece of pizza in his hands. The guy had ordered a lot of takeaway food and was offering his colleague to share the meal with him. The champion was irritated. She didn't expect to see this impudent guy again so quickly. Was he really following her, and that's why he was constantly in the same room with the girl? The karateka did not want to reignite the conflict, so she simply turned around and went in a different direction from the young man. Now was not the time and place to discuss their relationship. Zhao Yu blocked the beauty's path, not allowing her to escape so easily. He planned to talk to her no matter what it took. The young man leaned close to the girl. He realized that the young lady had simply wasted her time and had not learned anything interesting, which was why she was in such a depressed mood when she left the interrogation room. The guy, like no one else, knew about the suspect's addiction, so he believed that a person who was unconscious could hardly beat one of the forensic experts. Ku Ping's death was very strange in the young man's opinion. The girl in the shelter looked at the guy, but still could not understand his intentions. It was completely unclear what he was trying to achieve. The detective was just waiting for the champion to finally become interested in his plans. He recalled how they interrogated Liu Pengfei together. In the past, the police interrogation went completely unexpectedly for the girl, because they arrested the criminal on a completely different case. When he confessed to the murder of Yu Jigen, Captain Miao remembered the results of their cooperation with the young man and could not say anything, because they really worked well together last time. The hero smiled and handed the young lady a box of pizza. They had a very interesting conversation ahead, but first they still needed to eat. Detectives set up a video camera in the interrogation room to record everything that happened. Hao Meng turned to the officer. He couldn't wait for the end because he had said everything he could. In his opinion, the girl was just putting a spoke in his wheel. The captain came closer to the detainee. Had it really healed so early and the blood stopped flowing that he was expressing himself like that? The girl's eyes glowed red. She no longer resembled a person, but looked more like a piece of work. If the criminal so desired, she could make him bleed again. The horror on the suspect's face was genuine. He could not believe that the police officer wanted to beat a confession out of him in this way. The guy tried to keep his colleague from making a mistake, because if the doctor had to stitch up the criminal's wound, he would definitely find out why the new bleeding had started. And the killer thought that he might need a lawyer. The guy tried to stop the champion from making a mistake, and at the same time calm the prisoner down in order to stop the whole mess. Hao Meng also remembered the detective who shot him in the leg when he was arrested, and who was not trusted at all. The criminal promised to make sure that everything would come to light during the trial, and the police would be punished for their actions. The young man let go of the captain, whom he had been holding all this time, and rushed closer to the suspect to deal with him face to face for all his statements. There were tears in the eyes of the killer. Fear hid everything inside him in a strong, iron embrace. These two policemen were worse than devils. The detective lit a cigarette. They were in this room only for the sake of the truth, and if the prisoner did not kill anyone, he had to report it to help the investigation. Ho Meng did indeed do something that night, but he couldn't remember anything. He didn't know whether he killed someone or not, so how could the police be so sure of his guilt? Zhao Yu smiled when the suspect could then remember that it was the youth who grabbed him with such memory problems. The criminal's references to the night of his arrest were obscured. He did not understand how the man driving towards him suddenly disappeared. The hero believed that Haomon could have been hypnotized that day, which is why he saw a motorcycle without a person, and the captain could not understand what was being discussed at all. The killer was afraid that the policeman might be right because he really didn't remember anything. The detective connected an invisible lie detector and said that he would now ask questions to which answers should be yes or no. The prisoners agreed, because if he hadn't killed anyone, only this guy would be able to find out the truth. The policeman decided to start with the most important question. Was it the criminal who killed Ku Ping? Hao Ping was not sure of his answer, but he still took a chance and said that it was not him. The lie detector turned green, which meant that the man had told the truth. He was not the killer they were looking for, which did not surprise the officer at all, because from the very beginning it seemed to him that the murder was very strange. The guy continued asking his question, to which the suspect honestly replied that he had no idea who killed the former captain of Unit B. He realized that the man was simply being used by a real criminal for his own purposes, so he asked him if he had come to the scene of Ku Ping's death himself. The detainee did not remember exactly all the events of that night, and he felt so dizzy that it even seemed as if someone had shoved him into a car. The detector had a green button on it from the new one. That's what the man was saying. He didn't arrive at the crime scene alone. Even if the criminal didn't remember anything, the detector will show everything. The boy asked the man if the death was connected with the M case, to which the killer did not know what to answer. He did not understand what case they were talking about. The system displayed advice on using the polygraph. Do not ask questions that are not related to the topic. As it turned out, the detector also had limitations. It couldn't recognize the question on the topic M. But this didn't stop the guy from using it to find out who the real killer of Ku Ping was. The detective changed the rules of interrogation and told the detainee to answer all questions only in this way, remembering that in case of a lie, the red light would light up, and in case of the truth, the green light would light up. Hao Meng didn't understand why the policeman needed this, but he didn't dare argue with his decision. Zhou Yu asked his interlocutor whether one person had killed the former captain of Division B, to which he responded as agreed, and the red light lit up. The detective continued to list the possible murders of the girl by 2 people, or 3, or even 5, but all of these answers turned out to be incorrect. The policeman's face reflected horror. Was it possible that more than 10 people had agreed to attack Ku Ping? Finally, the light turned green and their colleague was attacked by a large pack of people from whom there was no chance of fighting off. The veins on the guy's face bulged. He didn't understand what the girl could have done to deserve such sympathy, what she had done to make so many people conspire to kill her. Miao Ying saw the changes in the fight and the young man's appearance, but she could not understand what caused them, because she knew nothing about the invisible lie detector. The guy couldn't look at the new captain of Division B now, and simply answered without turning around that he already knew the answer, and it was time for them to leave. The champion did not understand why there was such a rush, what her colleague had learned that had upset him so much and thrown him off track. Zhao Yu walked down the corridor without stopping. The young lady did not understand why the guy was so mysterious, because the questions he asked were definitely very important, so she should have known about it too. The young man sighed heavily. He and the policewoman had different goals. He had come to question not only about Ku Ping's death, but also wanted to find out something about M's case. The boy finally returned to his colleague. It was important for him to know why she transferred to Department R. Was it really to have access to the case of the girl's murders? The beauty did not expect such a question from the officer. She simply looked at him with wide eyes, not knowing whether it was worth answering such questions now. Not all issues had been resolved between the young people, and therefore it was important for the young man that his opponent right now be as honest with him as possible and tell him the truth. The elite fighting champion smiled. It seemed like it was time for serious talk. There was no longer any way to delay this moment.